الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Islamic Center at New York University podcast, coming to you straight from the heart of New York City. We're building an amazing Muslim community here at ICNYU where everyone is welcomed and respected no matter where you're from or where you're at. This is the place to be. So open your ears and your heart and come along with us on another life-changing journey. Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah walhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Alhamdulillah, we're blessed tonight to have Sheikh Dr. Rania Awaad here, mashallah, who in a couple minutes will do a more formal introduction of. But just to get us started, we have a brother who, it's his first day here in the IC community, mashallah. He's here from the UK, our brother Latif, who is going to start us off with a recitation of the Quran. You want to come up?
Assalamu alaikum. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وتركنا بعضهم يومئذ يموج في بعض ونفخ في الصور فجمعناهم جمعا وأعرضنا جهنم يومئذ للكافرين عرضا الذين كانت أعينهم في غطاء عن ذكري وكانوا لا يستطيعون سمعا أفحسب الذين كفروا أن يتخذوا عبادي من دوني أولياء إنا أعتدنا جهنم للكافرين نزلا قل هل ننبئكم بالأخسرين أعمالا الذين ضل سعيهم في الحياة الدنيا وهم يحسبون أنهم يحسنون صنعا أولئك الذين كفروا بآيات ربهم ولقائه فحبطت أعمالهم فلا نقيم لهم يوم القيامة وزنا ذلك جزاؤهم جهنم بما كفروا واتخذوا آياتي ورسلي هزوا إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات كانت لهم جنات الفردوس نزلا خالدين فيها لا يبغون عنها حولا قل لو كان البحر مدادا لكلمات ربي لنفد البحر قبل أن تنفد كلمات ربي ولو جئنا بمثله مددا قل إنما أنا بشر مثلكم يوحى إلي أنما إلهكم إله واحد فمن كان يرجو لقاء ربه فليعمل عملا صالحا ولا يشرك بعبادة ربه أحدا.
Brother Keek is here for 10 days, mashallah. I met him at Jummah today, and I told him I'd introduce him to people, and then I forgot. And now I just introduced him to a lot of people. So, mashallah, make sure you welcome him the way that you would welcome anybody to the community. Alhamdulillah, it's our blessing that you're here with us even for a short period of time. Jazakallah khair. The Quran creates immense opportunity for barakah, and within this moment, just as your hearts are open, we had a couple of dua requests before we get started. We were made aware of a brother in the community who passed away recently. His name is Ali Shah. If you can make dua for him, his maghfirah, Allah grants him peace and entrance into Jannah without any judgment. One of our graduate students, Maryam, she has asked that we make dua for the father of one of her friends who's struggling with a severe form of cancer. If you make dua, Allah grants him a complete healing and shifa, a quick and easy recovery. He makes this ailment a means of purification in this world and a means of elevation in the next, and brings to them ease at this time as their loved one is going through this difficult situation. Alhamdulillah, tonight we have Dr. Rania Awaad here with us. Before I introduce her, I'm going to ask you all to just do me a favor, and if everyone can do it, you can see people are starting to trickle in, but there is a good amount of room, so if you can all just move up close. I want to come in, as close as we can. If there's gaps in front of you that you can fill up, we'd appreciate it. And as people come in, you can feel free to, there you go.
Getting real cozy.
Just come sit on the table right here if you like. Feel free. And as people trickle in and you see them come in, maybe you can ask them to also just move up as best as possible. So for those who don't know, Dr. Rania Awaad is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine, where she's also the director of the Stanford Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab, associate chief of the Division of Public Mental Health and Population Sciences, and co-chief of the Diversity and Cultural Mental Health section. On a community level, she's the executive director of the holistic mental health nonprofit, Maristan.org, which I think tonight we'll hear a little bit more about, inshallah. In addition, she serves as the director of the Rahma Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating Muslim women and girls. She's a senior fellow at the Yaqeen Institute and ISPU. She previously served as the founding clinical director of the Khalil Center in San Francisco, as well as a professor of Islamic law at Zaytuna College. And prior to studying medicine, she pursued classical Islamic studies in Damascus, Syria. And Allah make things easy for the people of Syria. And she holds certifications, ijazat in Quran, Islamic law, and other branches of the Islamic sciences. If you can all join me in just quickly welcoming Dr. Rania, mashallah, and give her a round of applause. And so tonight we're going to have a conversation on just mental health awareness. We're really blessed, mashallah, to have Dr. Rania with us. I know I just read her bio, but I can tell you, having served this community, alhamdulillah, for now 17 years, and going through so much in terms of our community's growth, but visiting cities around the country, different parts of the world, where many people are constantly in a state where they're just starting a conversation on mental health. Dr. Rania, mashallah, has made continued contributions to what is historically rooted in the foundation of our religious tradition around mental health and its overall placement in our faith. And we need to have people who understand aspirationally, like many of you do, that you sometimes can have something be either or, but sometimes it's necessary for it to be both and. That we have to have individuals who bring together interdisciplinary modes of engagement, but we need trained individuals who also understand both what Sharia says, as well as are trained in mental health sciences to the highest potential of credential that you can have. And Dr. Rania, mashallah, is an example of a void that needs to be filled even more so. And I hope that you can take as much inspiration as I have from her and the work she does, and think for yourself as you hear from her also, as many of you are practitioners in this field, as well as you're aspiring to potentially have interactions with your own wellness in various facets. What does it mean for us to now take from an individual and think about how we can institutionally fill a gap? And how we can ensure that where you might have aspirations, you can think about what it means to be a well-rounded practitioner in this field. Dr. Rania's got a talk online that I think is on the Khalil Center's YouTube channel. It's called The Islamic Origins of Mental Health, or The Islamic Roots of Mental Health, or something like that. I don't know. She probably doesn't listen to herself online. And it's honestly one of the best lectures I've ever heard in my life, mashallah. But what it gives in terms of insight into how our religious tradition was like steps ahead of others centuries ago in this field. And it totally just destroys any sense of stigma that Islam and mental health somehow are things that have to be mutually exclusive. They don't have any type of relationship to each other. I definitely recommend that you listen to that as you listen to her tonight. You listen to so much more that she has online. Think about how you can be a supporter of the organizations that she's started. And make dua, as I'll remind you at the end, also that Allah makes her a continued source of benefit for both our community as well as His creation in general. And so to give you a structure for the evening, Dr. Rania is going to share some opening thoughts with us, after which we will open up to hearing from you all, any questions, any thoughts that you might have. We'll likely go till around 8 o'clock or so, between 7:30 and 8. And at the end of the program, for those who haven't made Isha, we'll make a Jama'ah for Isha at that time, inshallah. Great. Okay. So Dr. Rania, please feel free at your convenience to start, inshallah. Start us off.
Thank you so much, Imam Khalid. Well, I'll say assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. It's all here, mashallah. It's wonderful to be here amongst you all. Thank you, Imam Khalid, mashallah. I kind of wanted to disappear a little bit. But I appreciate it. Barakallahu feek. And I just want to first say it's wonderful to be here at the ICNYU. I think it's just amazing to see all of you and to see the work. And 17 years.
Yeah, I'm getting old.
MashaAllah.
See his way there.
MashaAllah. That's a lot of Allah. Please du'as for Imam Khalid, inshallah, and for all of you, because it's really a communal kind of program. Clearly, you wouldn't have the kind of successes that are happening here if there wasn't a lot of hearts and hands kind of working together. May Allah bless you all. Allahumma ameen. I will say before I begin, I was telling some of the sisters earlier, I have some NYU roots.
Oh.
Not my own, but my father trained here.
Mashallah.
So I grew up in my early life. You know, my mom worked at United Nations, my dad trained at NYU.
You're one of us. Don't fight it.
It feels like, but I have my Stanford colors on. Alhamdulillah. So it's wonderful to be here, wonderful to be back in many ways. Alhamdulillah, even though it was childhood for me, but it's always wonderful to be back. MashaAllah. So we'll start, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'in. Inshallah, just a few remarks, just some thoughts, things that I've been thinking about in traveling across. What brought me here today to New York today is that tomorrow there's actually an entire training, a full day training for our Imams, our religious leaders and spiritual leaders, our community leaders, on the very difficult topic, and I'm going to give my trigger warning because it is a difficult topic, on the topic of suicide in Muslim communities. And we're training them because we feel like it's really important for leaders on the front line to really know the red flags and know how it is to actually help and intervene. So that's what brings me here. And in the meantime, alhamdulillah, I have the blessing of being able to come to all of you tonight, mashallah, and a couple of other communities in Jersey right before here. And just reflecting kind of on those conversations that I've been having the last few nights and thinking about how for so many people, maybe not all of you in this room, but so many of the other folks that I've spoken to, there's still a really deep stigma and difficulty in talking about mental health. And really a feeling like it doesn't, like you were saying, doesn't actually feel like it belongs to us. And that was me. That was my story, right? I shared with some of the sisters earlier, you know, we were talking about psychology in classes, and I said, and I revealed, kind of was transparent about, that I actually didn't take a single psychology course in college. I didn't think this had anything to do with us. And I share that because I think it's important to know a person's path, like where they came from and how they came to do the work they do today. It's important to know where they came from. And for me, I had that internalized stigma that I felt like I grew up with in my family, in my community, friends, everybody around me, essentially have the same stigma. What is this psychology thing? Does it have anything to do with us as Muslims? And long story short, I'm going to shorten the story because it's a very roundabout story. MashaAllah. Ended up having, alhamdulillah, the opportunity and blessing to study overseas in Syria when it was, and I'm not Syrian, but I had the opportunity to study there when it was still a country that was safe and sound, especially for a woman to study. That's a whole other story for another time, mashallah, because it's a beautiful story. All the women scholars of Damascus, mashallah. in the process of studying and coming back and teaching in the community, it became really clear that there was a lot going on, that I didn't have the language or the understanding to really help, but I wanted to help. I had the textbook knowledge of Islam, halal, haram, yes, no, fiqh rules, that was my specialty, which is fiqh Islamic law, and could give a lot of answers, but when people brought their life circumstances and their life questions, I was in above my head. And that's an important lesson and discussion for our religious leadership and community leadership to know when it is that you've reached your limits. And you need to refer to someone who's more learned in that, or if you want to do that work, that you yourself go and do that actual training, and not try to answer work into space that's not your lane, subhanAllah. And so for me, I was on a path of studying medicine. I thought I was going to do a completely different route in medicine. And it was actually, and this is where my husband, I thank him a lot, subhanAllah. He kind of looked at me one day after we had a number of kind of series of incidents in the community on a religious level where we didn't have words to explain what we were seeing. Today, I can tell you some of those cases were depression or trauma. Some of probably the straw that broke the camel's back, I think for both of us, was as a beautiful sister in our community who just is a wonderful person who we didn't have the words to explain what she was going through. And today I can tell you it's called a first break psychosis. We didn't know what that was. And in that process, everybody, and I'm talking about so many people more learned than us, who were saying, this is definitely some sort of jinn possession. This is some sort of ayn, evil eye, or, kind of supernatural possession that's come to her. Or we're saying things like, just have mercy, rahmah, where's the mercy here? Nobody had the wherewithal, literally nobody had the wherewithal to say, we might need to take her to the emergency room. Nobody even connected that this could have been a medical emergency, literally, right? And subhanAllah, the person this is interesting, subhanAllah, the person who eventually said, I think she needs to go to the emergency room was one of our local dentists. SubhanAllah, who had some wherewithal that this could be psychosis. That night, I remember my husband looked at me and said, look, I was going into women's health, and he said, so many women, so many wonderful doctors who are well-trained can do that work, but not a whole lot of people have the Deen Sharia training to be able to then also bridge it to mental health. And I said to him, what are you saying? What are you saying? Because the back and funny story to the whole story is I was so far into my medical school training at that point that all my letters of recommendation literally said OB. So when I literally pivoted into psychiatry at the last minute without even planning it, this is Allah's plan, my letters still said OB. And so I go to these, residency training interviews, and the program directors would read all this and be wonderful, wonderful. What are you trying to be, an OB or a psychiatrist? They were so confused. I said, I don't know, subhanAllah, because we plan and Allah plans and Allah is the best of planners. And now as I look back on it, subhanAllah, there really is kind of a divine wisdom in some of this. But I'll tell you, I entered into the field very suspicious of it. I wasn't planning on it, right? And I wasn't really sure because all I could really connect psychology to was Freud. Like it didn't seem like it had any connection to us. And I had my Sharia training already, so everything that I looked at was from this lens of what did Islam have to say about this? What do the early Muslim scholars have to say about this? Is there a space for this? Because we would hear growing up, early Muslims contributed to the sciences, to medicine, to surgery, to the humanities. I heard nothing about mental health. I don't know if any of you guys did. Anybody? Anybody hear a connection of mental health? Even when they talk about the golden ages, nothing. There was no connection to that. Long story short, that led to some of the work that I was doing and kind of pulling out the early primary texts, right? We call it turath. Literally our treasure trove of Islamic understanding of what the scholars wrote. And for me, it was very personal. It wasn't like I was planning to make this public. It was a very personal thing, what did the scholars say? And in that process, subhanAllah, came across so much related to psychology and mental health. And it was very holistic. It wasn't very limited the way you think of psychology or psychiatry today. And I think that's what was so special about it. And so I'll share a backstory that then I think kind of opens the conversation to a lot of other things. Because for me, that was kind of a door that opened. And some of you may have heard this story, so forgive the repetition of it, but if you haven't heard it, it was such a milestone for me. I was going through some early texts, and we'd hear about famous Muslim physicians. Ibn Sina, yeah? Al-Razi, yeah? Al-Balkhi. So you hear Balkhi now, alhamdulillah, because we started to actually talk about it. I'm so glad, alhamdulillah. But it wasn't a known name. He wasn't a known entity. Because the reason Balkhi was famous, his name is Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. He's from the 9th century. And the reason he was famous at all is because he was famous for geography. He had an entire school of geography called the Balkhian School of Geography, and that's all we knew him for. There's a whole backstory of one of our mentors, rahimahullah, Professor Malik Badri, if you ever hear of him, who found his book, Al-Balkhi's 9th century book, in the Aya Sophia's library, miscategorized, I guess, in a section that wasn't supposed to be there. Another professor had found it and gave it to him. And it had been there for hundreds of years, literally, like collecting dust. And nobody had known that Balkhi had written this manuscript. And the manuscript is about mind and body connection. That concept isn't a New Age concept. It turns out that that's something the early Muslims wrote a lot about, the connection between mind, body, and soul. And when they talk about mental health, they talk about it as that connection of all things together, not just physical, separate from mental, separate from spiritual. Does that make sense? So in Balkhi's writings, I was reading this in Arabic before, some of it now is translated by Professor Malik. But in reading his book, as a trained psychiatrist kind of going through training, I'm reading this and I'm going, this is depression. And reading this next chapter, it's like, this is anxiety, right? And reading the next chapter and going, these are phobias, right? And then I got to a chapter that really blew my mind. Like, that little emoji that goes like that, And it was obsessions. So the concept of waswasa in Islam is that, and this is what Balkhi says, all humans have some level of waswasa, obsession. But then he says some individuals will have more waswasa than average. And that is a medical disorder. That's not just shaitan, which all of us have some level of it, and we say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, and you move on. But someone that has what he describes as a pathological level of waswasa, that needs medical treatment. And then he classifies it, diagnoses it, and then gives you all the symptoms. And I'm reading this going, what? 9th century. The problem is, in our classes of psychology and psychiatry, when they teach us the history of psychology, they say OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, this was the closest thing to it. They say that's a new illness, a modern illness, that it wasn't discovered until the 19th century. That's what every book of history of psychology or history of medicine, that's what it says. And it'll say that the Greeks and Romans may have mentioned a little bit on some obsession. And then they'll talk about this person in the 16th century who had like one case scenario described, but it wasn't really formalized until the 19th century. I won't bore you with history lesson, I promise. I'm just giving you this background because when I came across this, I was like, what is this? Turns out that one of the preeminent scholars of OCD was at Stanford. The guy who wrote like the textbook on OCD was with us at Stanford. And his office was right down the hall from mine. So, walked over and said, hey, I think I found something. I think I found a reference to OCD a whole lot earlier than what we learned. And he said, no. And I said, no, really. And then he starts literally, no joke, he starts pulling off papers off the shelf that he had written. And he goes, here's the one of the Romans. Here's the one of the Greeks. Here's this and that. And he's like, no, there's nothing earlier than that. That's the way you're describing. And, you want to be respectful to your professor, your elder. But at the same time, I got kind of frustrated. So I said to him, can you read in Arabic? He was like, no. Can you? And I said, yeah. And he was like, he just paused for a little after he did all that hand waving. And then he was kind of like, fine, go translate it and come back. Typical professor move, right? Like, all right, fine. So I took up the challenge and actually translated that particular chapter of Balkhi's book, presented it to him a couple weeks later and showed him, because for me, I was like amazed that not only did he get the classification right, but all of the symptoms that he describes are actually the way a modern psychiatrist would describe and put all the symptoms in order, right, today. And our book that we psychiatrists and psychologists diagnose from is the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychiatry. And so I put BAMMH's 9th century criteria and the DSM's criteria side by side. When he saw this, he started jumping, like legit. He started jumping, and I was like, "Oh dear!" And he was so excited, not for the fact that what I was excited for. Oh, the Muslims figured this out, right? That kind of excited. He was excited. Was as a scientist, right? That this is scientific. This kind of scientific discovery is going to rewrite the chapters and the books of history. So he was interested in the scientific merit of it. So I wasn't thinking about publishing. He said to me, this has got to get published. And I was like, where? And he said, mainstream medical journals. It needs to be in the mainstream, not published in some Muslim journal somewhere, like, which is good. But I mean to say, in the mainstream. People have got to understand this. I was like, all right. So we signed up to academic publishing, right, to the journals. This first paper on BAMMH in OCD got accepted immediately, which almost never happens in academic publishing. There's a lot of peer review and so on, and back and forth. This one got published immediately, so we were like, okay, let's write another one. So we wrote one on BAMMH and phobias. That one took forever. That's when you really see the academic, like, there's pros and cons to academic writing. For those of you who are going into any sort of the world of academia, there's pros and cons, but you can see something really interesting here. They finally wrote back to me after like months, and I thought for sure they're going to reject this paper. But when they wrote back, they said, what you're saying is so unorthodox. That's the word they used. Unorthodox. You're like pushing against all of the books of psychology, right? That we need to hire historians of medicine to verify your claims. I said, all right, go for it. You know? So they took a few more months to do that. And when the reviews come back, and if you guys know about academic publishing, it's a double-blinded peer review process. And so they don't know who I am, they don't know my institution. They just read the work itself, and they judge it based on the merit. And when they wrote back, they said, this paper overturns the history of psychology. That's a bottom. So we're sitting in our office going, oh. But what was really exciting is that one of the reviewers, you know, well, the part that wasn't exciting, I'll tell you guys, is that he kept calling me a he. Right? He found, I was like, oh God, right? Because double bias, they don't know who I am. But at the same time, that's the bias of academia. But he actually says, see, I said he. Could be she. Just did a reverse bias. Anyhow, the reviewer found out, said that this work of BAMMH actually overturns kind of the main historian of psychology. This guy's name is Barrios. And there are some people who literally just write the Muslims out of history, as in to say, you feel like it's accidental. Like they don't mean to, they didn't know. They're like writing Greeks and Romans and jumping all the way to Freud. Or just the 19th century or 18th century. But there are some people that write about the Muslims and you feel like it's like purposeful, you know, kind of leaving us out. So Barrios says, yeah, the Muslims came around and translated the works of the Greeks, but they contributed nothing of their own. And that feels very heavy. But it also feels like the story that I would hear growing up, that Muslims don't have any space in the psychology world, right? But then it turned out, if you're going to have someone like BAMMH figure out something like OCD so far away, or so long ago, and then not only that, but if you think about what he doesn't just classify and diagnose it, he actually tells you the treatment, and that's what the reviewer was writing about. Can you imagine that BAMMH in the 9th century figured out, he tells about 3 steps, and he says, this kind of condition needs medication. This is really important. We're going to come back to this. That some mental illnesses, some mental health conditions require medications. And that's still really hard for a lot of people in our communities. They're not ready to quite hear that. And they're like, just pray more. Just have more Imam. But we don't have proof from our early scholars that that's what they said. Why? Because BAMMH then goes on and he says, number 2, he says a person that has this level of obsession actually needs to have talk therapy. talk therapy. I won't say the Muslims created talk therapy, okay? What I'll say, because I might have, what I'll say at least is that they absolutely wrote about it, they developed it, and they pushed it, and they became very sophisticated in talk therapy. So much so when you read BAMMH's description of his treatment of OCD, he comes up with a kind of talk therapy that we use today. Anybody know what the treatment for OCD is? What kind of CBT?
ERP.
What's ERP stand for?
Exposure response prevention.
Yeah, exactly. It's a type of exposure therapy. A gradual exposure therapy where little by little by little you work on the very things that you have an obsession about. Or in phobia, same thing. Little by little by little, the things that you have some fear about. The fact that he describes that and tells you how exactly to do this in the 9th century blew those historians of medicine out of the water. They were just like, what is this, right? Because it's so clear that he was able to not only fully understand this, but also how to treat it. But he didn't stop there, and this is where it's really important. The third step, BAMMH says, is the spiritual part. So he quotes verses of the Quran and aspects from the Hadith, where he tells the person who's afflicted by this that this isn't just shaitan. You got to do more than just your adhkar and dhikr. But in the meantime, you've got to remember that Allah is there and is going to help you. Because whatever He sends you, He promises He's going to help you get through it. That 3-level, mind, body, soul, is that holistic understanding of how Muslims understood and treated mental illness. That's our tradition. And I get really passionate about this because you could see it clearly in their writings. So that was exciting. But before I move from BAMMH, I'll just tell you the funny story about the professor who inspired all this, inspired us to start, because it was actually those first publications that started my lab, the Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology lab that's at Stanford now, alhamdulillah, entering into about its 10th year next year, inshallah. It was those early papers that kind of started the whole process. The professor's name is spelled Koran. We Muslims have this concept of fan hasan, like good omens, you take a good omen. So Dr. Quran, not Muslim, but I'll give him hidayah, but was really, kind of inspirational. There are some important people who come along in the past who kind of see something for its merit and are able to kind of push it along. You know what I mean? So he was one of those people. And later, after publishing all about the people and the actual thinkers and the main people kind of in the field of what we would call ilm al-nafs, the field of Islamic psychology as we call it today, which is they talked about their psychology. There's not a perfect Arabic translation, but basically it's the study of your soul, the study of yourself, right, is how they conceptualized it. And it's very interdisciplinary. So we wrote about the physicians that contributed and the theologians that contributed and the people of philosophers basically that contributed, kind of that very holistic contributions to that field, because every single one of those disciplines contributed. And that sets it apart from modern psychology. But then eventually, after writing about people and their theories, the question became, do they just write theories or do they actually treat people? And this is where the discussion that I'm currently working on, which is that theory went into institutions. They built actual institutions of healing. And those institutions were called the Maristans. Who here knows what the word Bimar is? Who speaks Urdu or Farsi?
Sick.
Someone who's sick. Stand. Location. So it is the location, right, where a person who's sick goes to. In Arabic, the version is called Daru Shifa. It's the place of healing, the place of Shifa or healing. So it's the hospitals. So our research is showing, and we're working on a book right now on the Maristans. Please make dua for it. We shortened the word from Maristan to Maristan because that's the Latinized version of the word that became commonly used in the literature, at least in the English language now. And so the Maristans or Maristans, to our research, are the first hospitals in human history that had psychiatric wards in the hospital. When you compare when these started in the 8th century to what was happening before in the civilizations before them, the Greeks, the Romans, Indian civilizations, Chinese civilizations, you don't find that their hospitals had mental health treatment in them. When you compare to Europe across the way, same time period, you find that the mentally ill are very poorly treated. They're either being burned like witches at the stake in this era, or they're sent to the people of religion, to the priests and the nuns, like convalescence homes where they're just sort of, praying on them and praying for them and helping them, but there's no actual medical treatment. It's not understood as a medical illness. So why is that important? Because in the Islamic tradition, you don't actually find proof that the people who had mental illness or mental health conditions were sent to the shiukh. That's not our tradition. That's not our tradition. People who had a mental illness were sent to the hospitals. And there were wards and sections, just like there was for surgery and obstetrics and internal medicine and eye diseases, there was psychiatric mental health treatment. Did you know that? Do you have any idea of this history?
Excuse me, can I ask?
I had no idea of this history. I'll just finish my thought, inshallah, so take questions, inshallah. No worries. Just when you think about that, not only should it make you proud as a Muslim, but you also have to understand and ask yourself, how did the Muslims come across this and do this when no other civilizations before them had done it? That's when you start to understand that the impetus, the push for this is actually directly from the Quran and the Sunnah. That's really important to understand that connection. So when you read the writings of Ibn Sina's and Razi's and so on, what you find is they're quoting specific verses of the Quran and specific hadith that inspired them to do this work in psychology. Probably the most common hadith that comes up over and over in the writings of the scholars is a hadith in which the Sahaba are asking the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if we get ill, if we fall ill, should we get treatment? As in to say, is it enough to just pray? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, yes, go get help. The verse, though, the wording in Arabic is tadawu ibadallah. Seek out treatments, O servants of God. If you get ill, seek out treatments. فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ لَمْ يَضَعْ دَاءً إِلَّا وَضَعَ مَعَهُ شِفَاءً. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not send down an illness to earth unless He sends with it its cure. In some narrations it says it's treatment, dawa, and in some narrations shifa. Why is that important? Because the early scholars took that and said, all right, whatever we see in society around us, whatever illness we see in front of us, we have to try to find its treatments or cure, because God says He's going to send help. And they did not discriminate between health and mental health. They didn't discriminate between physical health and mental health. And in their Maristans, you see that. Physical health and mental health, side by side. Does that make sense? So when you see that, and you see kind of the push from within the Quran, from within the Sunnah, I could quote the verses of the Quran, and I could also quote to you the foundational principles of Islam, which we call the maqasid al-sharia. In the foundational principles of Islam, which rules are built upon, you have a very important rule that says, one of the foundational rules, that says the preservation and optimization of your intellect. And anything that gets in the way of that means that you have to find cures and treatments and help for that person. So it was solid, it was clear to them. If we found a person who was mentally unwell, we have to not only find its treatments and cures, but create institutions of healing. Do you understand now the tradition? I hope I didn't bore you with the history lesson. But the reason I get very passionate about this is that unless you know your roots, unless you know the traditions in which you come from, you don't know what to build or whose shoulders to stand upon if you don't know your own background. I didn't. It took a lot of digging to sort this out. You see what I'm saying? And not only that, but in thinking about kind of now bridging it to the modern day, because there's a lot about modern medicine and modern psychology and psychiatry that's excellent and helpful. There's also a lot of garbage. Just saying. Mashallah. Things that don't quite... I can say that because I've done all my training. I can say that. Right? Mashallah. Don't say that until you've done your training. But there's things that just don't jive with our traditions. They don't jive with us as people who are God-centered people, who are people of faith. And I think that's important. So my mentor, one of my mentors, Dr. Malik Badri, would often say this, and actually he wrote a book in 1979 1979. He wrote a book called The Dilemma of the Muslim Psychologist. Wallahi, everything he wrote in that book is still true today. And anything you find by Malik Badri, look it up and get it. Mashallah. Excellent. He had this great book on contemplations, and I think it's really beautiful too. Anyhow, in the book on the dilemma of the Muslim psychologist, and I'll end with this, inshallah, take your questions, but he says in there, one of the dilemmas of Muslim psychologists is that we get so fascinated by the modern field of psychology, which is largely secular. And when you are a person of faith from a faith community, the reason that doesn't jive well, and even if you're trying in therapy, and even if you're trying to get the help, it doesn't quite sync up or click. And there are older generations or other people who are like, What are they reacting to? They're reacting to a void. Where on one hand in psychiatry, it's a lot of pill pushing. On the other hand in psychology, it's a lot of talking. But there isn't really that mind, body, soul connection altogether, right? And so he said he worried about this in 79, wrote that the Muslims who are going into psychology are taking the baby with the dirty bathwater. It's pretty edgy for his time. He was saying it's like taking the nut with the shell whole, like not even trying to filter out what's actually nutritious and helpful and what's not. You got to discard. That's really important, and that's still very much the case, and he was one of the founders really of the modern revival of the field we call Islamic psychology today. So in short, I'm just going to tell you one more thing about the Maristans. When we studied them, alhamdulillah, because of this book, I'm doing a lot of this field research and jumping from country to country, still visiting the Maristans that are still standing today. And what's so beautiful about so many of them is that you see it's not like a hospital the way you think of a hospital today. It's not this kind of very sterile, in many cases, scary place for a lot of people. This truly was a place of healing. It worked on all of the senses. So when you go in, some of the characteristics is that fountain in the middle, because they use the sound of water to calm a person down. They had greenery everywhere, because that too would calm a person with any mental turbulence down. They had the use of everything that's in the gardens, where actually they were using them as part of the medicine that they were creating. So every Maristan had either within it or next to it the sharab khana or the agza khana, or basically the pharmacy, where they would make medications. That's important because they didn't just do prayers for the person, they actually treated them with medications. That's our tradition. They had aromatherapy. They had sound therapy. And people sometimes get upset because we call it music therapy. And it's actually a combination between Quran and then nature sounds like bird sounds, but also musical instruments that they used for medicinal purposes. They took the sciences that they had from people before them, like the science of the maqamat. The maqams are the tones. Today, when we hear beautiful recitation of Quran, Jazakallah khair, you're reading in a tone. It's one of the maqams, even if you don't realize it. And what they did is they took the maqams, and you can see the writings of someone like Farabi who says, here is the tone when someone is really anxious that you play to calm them down. And this other tone over here, when they're very depressed, you pick them up with it. So in the Maristans, they would send orchestras. We have a couple papers working on right now, Ottoman music therapy, in the process of treating mental illness. And the Muslims were the first to take musical instruments and use it for the treatments of mental illness. Right? MashaAllah. Like I said, I could go on and on about this forever. MashaAllah. But it's beautiful because you need to understand the treatment of the five senses. And the spiritual aspect of this was absolutely included in all of it. Because just like you had the doctor and nurse who rotates on the patient, you also had the dietitian. You had the person who was the pharmacist. You had the person who was the social worker, literally. Because they cared for the person in the hospital, clean clothing and food and everything they needed, and after they were discharged. That person was part of the team. And the religious leader. So today you would say a chaplain. So just like the doctor was seeing that patient every single morning, so was the chaplain as part of that team, giving them their religious advice and helping them through what they were going through. But there was the medical and the spiritual. There was the physical and the mental. Do you see what I'm saying? All together. That's our tradition. So when you have something that's disjointed from each other, this is why people feel like it doesn't belong to us, because it feels like something is missing here. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So inshallah, I mean, I ask you, inshallah, I'm ready to kind of take questions and hear what you all have to ask and say, inshallah ta'ala. But I do hope, I'll just say this in closing, inshallah. I do hope that as we look into the discussion on mental health and on psychology and on really just wellness and well-being in general, that we think about the importance of that holistic care. I know that's what we're trying to do at Maristan, and I want all of your du'as, please. Because the dream, the kind of like the long-term dream here, is actually revive the concept of the Maristan, the holistic treatment of mental health care. And people are like, why are you doing this in America? Well, so many of our countries are still colonized minds, unfortunately, where whatever happens in America or the West first means it's best. And so, I'm telling you, I was in Turkey and doing the field research for the Maristan book, and I saw Dr. Imam there, and he said to me, thank you for putting the word Islamic psychology in your lab. And I said, okay, why? And he said, I've been trying to convince the university in Turkey, which is a wonderful and progressive and wonderful university, but he's been trying to convince them to have a program on Islamic psychology, and they keep kind of like waving at him, like, you know. And then he said, but Stanford has it. And suddenly they were like, oh. It's subhanAllah. It's like, and they have the most beautiful Maristans. Oh my goodness. Anyhow, so when you think, so that's the dream, because somehow when it starts here and if the blueprints are done right, and that Islamic architecture and understanding and all of it has purpose and meaning, subhanAllah, it might catch on. Who knows? It might catch on in the long run. And one thing I didn't say is how it's funded. All of this treatment was free. All of it was from Beit al-Mal, used from zakat funds for some of the people, but the majority was actually endowments, the awqaf. It was self-sustaining. And that's why it lasted for centuries and centuries and centuries. I want us to think about where we donate, or one day, inshallah, when you guys are able to give the big dollars, inshallah, or even the dollar by dollar. Honestly, it's the kind of thing of like, have we ever thought about putting our charity to mental health? Because there's categories of the Quran that are absolutely important to care for. Your orphans, your refugees, those who are hit by natural disasters, those who are facing any forms of violence and difficulty. Mental health should be in that category too. They too are from the masakin. Do you see what I'm saying? That need that kind of help. But we don't really think about putting our charity towards mental health. But it needs to be there, and we have the tradition that was the case, right? That's how these institutions, these Maristans were run. So anyhow, I digress, but what I wanted to say about that is, it was a place where Muslims and non-Muslims were treated equally. And the physicians within it were both Muslim and non-Muslim, because it was about who was the person who was most qualified. And the reason we know this is there are letters of people who visited the Maristans or got treatment in the Maristans who weren't Muslim. Like this beautiful letter of a young Frenchman who went to one of the Maristans in Spain, Muslim Spain, and writes back to his father, and he says, "Dear father, you don't need to send me any money because everything here is free of charge." And then he talks about how clean the Maristan is. He said this so many times, clean, clean, clean. And he talks about how clean the sheets are, Damascene, sheets, and the food is so nutritious. And he talks about the type of talk therapy and music therapy and all the rest that the patients are given. And then how beautiful the scenery is. And he's praising all of this, and as you're reading this, you're going, subhanAllah, that's when people do this with ihsan, with excellence, the way Islam asks us to. And so you have people vouching for it who are not Muslim, right, but are experiencing and getting help from this tradition. And that's when you start to understand how far we've fallen off from all of this and how much we need to revive the legacy. So Maristan's tagline is, revive the legacy, reclaim the heritage, and rewrite the narrative. Because that very Eurocentric understanding of psychology is inaccurate. And we need to rewrite it, literally, the history of it. But don't blame anyone else. The finger goes this way, the fingers go this way. Because it's us having to write about ourselves and our tradition before we expect other people to do that for us. Do you see what I'm saying? So I said a lot, hopefully a lot to think about. But let's have a discussion, inshallah, and say your questions and go from there.
So just before we start with discussions and Q&A, I know that there's likely people who are going to be more than comfortable in kind of speaking out loud, which is fine. The nature of the conversation might also have some of you feel more comfortable if you can write things down. We don't have an apparatus set up technologically in terms of just a direct like code you could text message, but you can email me if you have my email address, which all of you probably do. If you have my cell phone number, you can text me too, which also probably a lot of you do. If you don't have either of those, you can just send an email to our generic admin account, info@icnyu.org, and we'll take a look at things there if you want to just keep things a little bit more anonymous, but you don't have to by any means. And also, just before we go into the Q&A, mashallah, how amazing was that, right? And aside from it and the content, but also how validating is it for so many of you in terms of things you've been struggling potentially, or things that you know people have struggled with, and you know that it wasn't necessarily you that were at fault in terms of the absence of resources or the walls that you've hit. And if you can stay through the end of the conversation, which is not going to go on throughout the entirety of the night, but as people put into this space what it is that they want to hear Dr. Rania's thoughts on, just listen to it with an openness. And recognize also that you might hear people in this space make themselves vulnerable, and by being as supportive as sisters and brothers, as our tradition teaches us, when someone allows for us to benefit through their vulnerability. Does that make sense? It's not the space for any one of us within or after the fact to engage in refutations, to listen, to respond in a mode of refutation, but just to listen empathetically, to listen to understand. I don't know what everybody's going to ask, but just to create some kind of guidelines to it before we start putting things there. Likely it's not going to all be academic discussion, and there's going to be things that come up that we want to ensure that as somebody opens up, they don't regret that they did that. Does it make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So if you want to send stuff via email, you want to shoot me a text, but also if people have things that they'd like to just say, out loud. Do you have your hand raised?
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't we start here and then we'll just work around, and however you want to go for it. And I'll just
of course.
Hi, I'm closer, so I guess it's like good that I start. I am a fourth year EM bound medical student right now. And a lot of the times, the first time you see like a psychiatric emergency, is in the ED. I don't know if it's like the best place to make an impact, but a lot of the times there is no way to like transition that into like an inpatient hospitalization. And there is room for impact, but I don't know like clinically like what's the best way to like go about that.
So your question is, how do you make an impact in the emergency room? Yeah. And are you saying that you can or can't get them to inpatient hospitalization?
Like a lot of the times, like their condition doesn't warrant like an inpatient hospitalization, but
So
they
they're
would
discharged.
Yes, they're discharged, but they would really benefit from like psychiatric
Resources.
education and resources.
Yeah, we were just talking about resources, SubhanAllah. And I was asking, what are the resources here in the New York general area here, or the Tri-City kind of area? I know some folks are coming from different places. And I think that's you being in the emergency room and knowing that people are going to be discharged, because only those who kind of have severe enough of a case that they're going into the inpatient psychiatric section would have that direct referral, and everybody else kind of goes back home, essentially, and may get lost to follow-up. And so if you literally have that handy kind of list of all the resources, that might be one of the biggest places of impact. We call it the warm handoff, where you're able to say, here are the resources, or maybe you even know certain people or certain institutions, organizations on that list, and you literally highlight it and be like, please call tomorrow. Maybe not them, but maybe a family member that comes and gets them, or a loved one, and say, please call such and such. That warm handoff actually could be much stronger, because you're giving kind of a thumbs up to the resources on the list. It might be super helpful, right? Because you're right, they're going to leave and you may never see them again, right? And they may never come back again. That's the thing. Yeah, thanks for the question.
So we had one that came in where someone asked, I lost my father recently and have struggled with resulting grief and depression, which has constantly been called un-Islamic by my family. and even a Muslim psychologist that I sought out said it was un-Islamic. This has added deep guilt and caused me to cope by numbing. Would love to hear your thoughts in regards to this.
Yeah, subhanAllah, may Allah bless you, and may Allah give your father Jannah, Allahumma ameen. And you and your family and loved ones still their patience. You know, it bothers me so much, honestly, when people say the kind of ways we grieve are un-Islamic. Because I don't know exactly where all that comes from. Because what I could share with you is directly from the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, directly from the examples we see in the Quran, and directly from, I think about this so much, like how if Allah wanted, He could have sent His religion just down in a book. He could have sent the tablets down, the Quran down. He could have sent it without messengers, the Rusul and the Anbiya. And the reason He had people, humans, even if they are in fact, if you think of the Prophet ﷺ, the most perfect of all humans, khayri khalqillah, the most perfect of all creation of Allah, but a human, nevertheless. And when you look at the stories of the Prophet ﷺ, speaking of loss and grief, do you guys know how many children the Prophet ﷺ lost in his lifetime? 7. How many children did he have in total? 7. And how many did he lose in his lifetime? 6. Who was remaining? Sayyidina Fatima Zahra, who died very shortly after him. Just take a moment. Many of you may not necessarily be parents yet, and some of you are. But just put yourself with empathy into his shoes, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When a parent has to bury their own child before them, can you imagine that intense grief? Now think about almost every one of your children you buried with your own hands. And some of your grandchildren too. That's the story of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when people start talking about grief and death and losing loved ones, you could see in every example of his story, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not just difficulty, but you see real human emotion coming through. And so we have all these narrations at every one of these deaths that happened. And I'll give you one that was really powerful. It's the death of his own son, Ibrahim. And there are multiple narrations where you see the Prophet crying. And the Sahaba, right, so I just said, if Allah wanted to send a messenger, He could have just sent it as a book. But He also gave you a messenger to show you how to live that message. So we call the Prophet ﷺ the walking Quran, right? But it didn't stop there. He also gave him Sahaba, a community, people. Why? Because they're going to have questions, they're going to have goof-ups, they're going to have difficulties that come up, and He's going to address them. And that becomes part of his sunnah, everything he says or does, because he has to enjoin the good and forbid the bad, right? So if it's happening wrong in front of him, he's got to say something or do something about it, right? It all becomes part of the sunnah. Why do I say the whole story? Because you see his own stories, and you see the stories of his companions, men and women, right? Children, older people. And through that, you start to really understand human psychology. So think about, here's his son, Ibrahim, who's dying, and he has him on his lap. And he's starting to cry. His tears coming down his cheeks. Well, people have a hard time with this, and they're like, don't cry. That's not strong iman. Or man up. I'm like, really, are you more man than the Prophet ﷺ? No, I'm serious. It bothers me to no end. Because you say this is your righteous and best example. But he cried. And the companions asked him about the tears. Because they're curious, they wanted to know. And so he responds, and he says, the eyes shed tears, and the heart feels sadness. But we don't say except that which pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As in to say the fate that's come, as his son is taking his last breaths on his lap. We're not going to say anything except we understand that this came from Allah. We're not going to say, why me, right? We're not going to push back on qadar. And then he says, your departure, he looks at Ibrahim, he says, your departure, O Ibrahim, truly saddens me. Then he looks at the mountain next to him and he says, if that mountain could feel the grief that I'm feeling, it would have crumbled. This is your Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When people feel that level of grief or anguish, that is human. That is normative. That is expected. And when other people shame them or silence them, that is unacceptable. When people say, you're not being a good Muslim because you are grieving in this way, you're crying in this way, you're still sad after months maybe. And who made you the most righteous person? No, I'm serious. Like, we don't have that tradition in our deen. We have a tradition of not wailing and screaming, okay? But we don't have a tradition where you can't be sad or you can't cry. In fact, the very most perfect person, the Prophet ﷺ himself, in each one of these traditions, in the narrations, he himself is crying and grieving and saying the mountain would crumble. Do you understand what I'm saying? Give people grace. Use the grace that the Prophet ﷺ had and taught his companions. And that very balanced understanding, it's not an extreme this way or that way, right? That middle nation kind of, ummatun wasata kind of middle path. Truly, I think when you really understand, I've been saying this ever since I saw Imam Siraj al-Hajj, one of our, as you know, someone who I've been learning from since I was a kid, subhanAllah. And on this last convention, he said something that really stuck with me. He said, when we know better, we do better. I think he says that often, right? But it was the first time I'd heard it, or maybe I heard it for the first time in a long time. It just stuck with me. And for the weeks since then, I've been saying it everywhere I go. When we know better, we do better. Wallahi, like when you know better about your tradition, you do better, right? Inshallah, we all know better and start to do better. Are we going this way, or should we start from this room? I think your hand's been up for a long time. Don't say that. But I'll get to everybody, I hope, inshallah.
here for this beautiful talk. I think first time I heard you was, I think I talked about you on Clubhouse and Ustada Hasai's talk. She introduced you to us. So thank you for all the work that you do. Something that I wanted to share, an international law professor at NYU shared this with us, saying that some of the neighborhoods within New York City, there was a very high rate of crime, and they brought Muslims from different parts of the world and settled them there, like the government level, because they knew that Muslims healed those neighborhoods. And they actually have data and analysis on it that it changed those neighborhoods when Muslim kings and stayed. I think recently too, I think it was published in news too, like wherever Muslims go, the neighborhoods, the stats changes. And I think it's just such a beautiful thing that we forget how much impact we do, because we are sent as mercy to mankind. There was a work of Carrie Al-Karam. She talks about Islamic psychotherapy, integrate what our worship and everything that we do, like praying, dhikr, how it actually helps. So she's taking that and bringing it to the Western world. Basically, she got all the Muslim psychologists and she wrote a book on it, and how sitting and focusing on your heart and doing dhikr or different kind of focus, how that heals us. So my question to you is, what are parts of our normal daily things that we do within the Islamic tradition that kind of helps us day to day of getting through or kind of grounding us more?
So what are the traditions in Islam that helps us?
Psychology, yeah. To heal us from
Healing traditions? SubhanAllah, there are so many. We'll be here till tomorrow, if we go through this. And you're right, mashallah, there are some recent writings which I really welcome and I think are wonderful. If you are looking to kind of understand, look, I'll tell you this, SubhanAllah, the whole time I was in training, and I think many of you who might be, some of you I guess are clinicians in the room as well, and as you're going through training, it is so hard, like in psychology or psychiatry, it is so hard to not hear specific theories and go, that's in the Quran, that's a hadith, that was in the Sirah, so on and so forth. And again, misappropriation of a lot of this, to be very honest with you, of work that's already within our traditions. I'm a big proponent of understanding what's within the tradition already and using, types of healing that are already indigenous to the Islamic religion. And I'll give an example that might be a little controversial, but bear with me. Most modern physicians today, or modern clinicians today, will prescribe, along with other things they're prescribing, meditation, mindfulness. They'll prescribe yoga. these things are considered to have now evidence-based knowledge behind them. There's been enough studies and research to show that they actually work. I'm not debating it. But what I am debating is the fact that so many Muslims are a little bit like unsure about using some of these things. And why is that happening? Because we know that some of those concepts, even though now they're secularized, they come originally from other religious traditions. And it's hard to break that away when you know that that particular yoga pose, for example, had a religious symbolism to it. It's hard to do that when you know where it came from, right? And so the question becomes, are there equivalents in the Islamic indigenous, right, from the tradition that are from Islam? So the second book that we're working on, multiple parallel books at the moment. One is on the Maristan's, but another one is actually it's actually called The Islamic Alternative to Mindfulness Meditation. And we had some pushback, let me tell you. And it's interesting, and the majority of the pushback were from Muslims. And the interesting thing about it is, I'm not debating that mindfulness meditation in and of itself has a healing property. It does. But what I'm saying is, do we know our own tradition? That's a question I keep asking over and over again. And when you pull up the tradition and actually do some of that writing and resources, looking at the resources, what you find is not only is there forms of mindfulness meditation, but they are not just strong and very helpful, but they have been around for centuries. And for many Muslims, it feels like home. It feels like this fits because it's part of the tradition, but we're not so aware of them. So you see the table in the back there. Inshallah, hopefully all of you guys, when you get a chance, kind of scan the QR codes. Please kind of get the resources from back there, inshallah. But one of the books that's right in the middle says, Applying Islamic Principles to Clinical Mental Health Care. Do you guys see that? In that book, we introduce, that whole book is basically for clinicians who are interested in having Islamic principles of healing into psychology. And it is written academic, so it's really for those who are hoping to be in the field. But one of the things we talk about are things like this mindfulness meditation, but inshallah we're going to do a whole book on just that topic alone. And we talk about how Imam al-Ghazali, for example, goes into great depth of talking about what I call the M's. Muraqaba, muhasaba, mu'ataba. These M's basically are the kind of, when you listen to them, if you've ever been to a therapist or if you've worked on CBT or if you've had a psychologist or therapist in your life before, you'll start to recognize some of the same things. The concept of taking yourself to account. The concept of journaling and understanding what you're doing day to day. The concept of, right, making sure that you are actually healing step by step. Then you have Ibn al-Qayyim, on the other hand, who has a beautiful book of tasawwuf, and people are like, really? Yes, Ibn al-Qayyim wrote a lot about tasawwuf. And in his writings of spirituality, he talks about what we call the T's. Tafakkur, tadakkur, tadabbur. These concepts, I'll translate that. The contemplation, right? The meditation, the really thinking about the creation of Allah, your place in the world, your relationship with Him, your relationship with all of humanity, the meanings of the Quran, and so on and so forth, are forms of meditation. But they're Islamic forms of meditation. They're not kind of an empty mindfulness, which is good, but it's empty. It doesn't have that direct something that connects you back to your Lord and the creation of your Lord. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So when you talk about are there Islamic principles of healing, there's a ton of them. Are they yet all written in English or kind of pulled from our early sources and kind of bridged to the modern? It's in progress, mashallah. And I do hope there's others who are going to actually, if you're interested, make sure you're following kind of the resources and the things that we have going on, because the field is growing. I feel like we've kind of reached a point where this field of Muslim mental health, which works with anybody, Muslim or non-Muslim, who are working with Muslims in mental health, versus the field we call Islamic psychology, which is a field in which you look at the origins of Islam first, and then you build a psychology from the ground up. They're two different fields, but they're connected to each other. And in the field of Islamic psychology, this is where you're taking kind of Islamic principles from the origins of them and bridging it to modern psychology. Does that help? Yeah. Give you some resources? Inshallah.
We had another online one. Maybe we'll do a few in person and then do one from people who are sending it confidentially. So this person said, a family member has severe mental illness that is mentally and emotionally exhausting for the entire family to deal with. How much responsibility do we have to take care of such family members
versus protecting our own mental well-being?
It's a great question, mashallah. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, honestly, this is what I'll say. There are reasons why there are support groups, literally for family members of those who have mental illness, particularly the more severe type. I want you to understand something. One is that there's a whole umbrella of what we call mental health. There are those that are diagnosable conditions: depression, anxiety, trauma, ADHD, so on and so forth, all the things that you can diagnose. Then there's a whole host of other forms that actually fit into the mental health umbrella as well. And when you hear them, you'll realize, oh, all of us can get therapy. And you don't have to have a diagnosis to get therapy. Because you know what fits under there? Things like marriage therapy. You don't need a diagnosis for that. But that's something most people need, because when they get married, you're not marrying a cookie cutter template of yourself. You're marrying somebody from a different background, different family life, different everything. Even if you are cousins, man, you are still. I'm not advocating for it necessarily. I'm just saying. I just came from Patterson and Browns. Everybody else, mashallah, the whole community are cousins of each other. Allah. Anyway, what I'm saying is, even if you're from the same family, you're still not the same people. 80% of marriage therapy is literally communication. Literally. And where marriages start to crumble and fail is actually in communication of two different people who are not templates of each other. And even more powerful than that is premarital therapy. And there are so many wonderful religious leaders now, I'm not going to look at Imam Khalid because I hope this is you, who are insisting that people, before they marry them, they actually get premarital therapy. The reason for that is, if you can catch something early on, then catch it then. You see what I'm saying? And if it's going to get fixed early on, great, then you know what to fix and work on. You see what I'm saying? You don't need a diagnosis for all of that. What else? Parenting. Kids don't come with manuals, right? A lot of that happens, and there's actual professional people. It's called marriage family therapists. This is what they train in, right? Anyhow, the reason I say that, I give you that whole backstory, is there's a whole umbrella of what is mental health. And then under mental health, there's a whole spectrum. Everything from mild to moderate, severe to extreme. And so when we talk about people who are in that, anything from mild, severe, from moderate, severe into extreme categories, that is, in fact, exhausting. And it's difficult. And when a person, a loved one, is not willing to get the care, you know they need help. If they're not willing to get that care, or they're insufficiently cared for, there's something that you have to know, and it's the first rule of therapy that we learn. And that is, you can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped. That's really hard for people to hear, because they want so desperately to help their loved one. But you can't force someone to get help that doesn't want to get help. So then people go, what do I do? Well, then what do I do? You know what the answer is? Well, first, maybe try to find someone other than yourself, who's not a family member or loved one, who that person respects, and maybe they'll listen to them. So try leveraging some of those networks. Then maybe that fails too. So now what? You know what the solution is, inshallah? You go get therapy. People really don't like when I say this. Because you're coming and asking me this question, right? So you're willing to get help, right? Because you're trying to push someone else to help, right? You're trying to get, why? Because it is exhausting and taxing to take care of someone else. So learn the techniques to not only protect yourself, but to help you figure out how to live with and love and care for someone who has a mental illness. Does that make sense? Yeah. And when you fortify yourself, then you can handle it a little bit better, because you can't force them. But you know what you might do in the process? When you start getting better, you might inspire them to get care. So you can't force someone into care, but you can inspire them. And I've seen that, wallahi, over the years of practice, I have actually seen that happen. I'll tell you just a quick question. This wasn't a spouse, and so it was a sibling story. I was working with this lady, and every session, without fail, I noticed her phone would go off. And so I'd remind her, please turn your phone off in session, and stuff. But it was still happening every so, it was like a certain hour, like within minutes of us starting, the phone would go off. And it was so repetitive that I was kind of like, I'm just gonna ask. I was like, I noticed your phone always goes off when we start the session. And she got like really red. And she goes, yeah, that's my sister. I said, "Khalid, what's going on?" And she says, "My sister calls me every single session to try to convince me to stop telling our family secrets." And I said, "This is a confidential space. The rules of confidentiality apply. Nothing is going." She's like, "Yeah, but my sister doesn't understand that. She feels like I'm betraying the family by speaking about these things." And so we go on, right, in sessions. And this particular person I'm working with experienced a ton of trauma. I won't go into details, just a lot of trauma in her life. And over the time we worked together, tabarakallah, she actually started to get much better. I mean, like visibly better. Like to where everybody in her family and friends are like, "Wow, what's going on? Mashallah, what's going on?" You know, like really visibly different. To the point that she started to get so much better that somehow she convinces her parents that they should go into therapy. Truly. Yeah, what? Yeah. Legitimately. Right? They were struggling with another sibling, right? And they all together did family therapy. When that happened, the sister who kept calling in every session, when she saw her sister get better, her other sibling get better, the parents start going to therapy, she was like, "Maybe I should try this too." And she did. The sister started going to therapy. The person who was the barrier for getting this person help and care, herself eventually, over some time in here, it took a while, but she herself was inspired to get that help too. You see what I'm saying? So don't give up. Inshallah, hopefully that can come through. Don't forget dua too. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Assalamualaikum. Threw me off. So I don't know how to articulate this question, so I might just talk it through. In terms of, I think one of the hallmarks and the scariest part of modern day psychiatry is and just mental health in general, right? In terms of wanting, I think that was a key component of CBT and motivational interviewing teaches us this. You can't want to get better more than the person who actually should get better, right? Or want to be involved in the therapy and the treatment more than the person who's actually needing it, right? So I think the scariest part of mental health and psychiatry and modern day hospitalization and stuff like that is this idea of being institutionalized against your will. And so I think it's an extreme, right? But obviously that exists in our communities when people have psychosis and all of these severe mental health conditions. In terms of your research and stuff, what did these holistic treatment settings that you mentioned, has your research said anything about holding people against their will?
Yeah, it's actually there. In fact, what we found, where we found the answer to that, we found some of the documentations of the Maristans, the hospitals, because it's so interesting. Is anybody in psychiatry? No? Have any of you that are in the field actually had where a patient is put on a hold and then they have to extend the hold and the judge comes into the hospital?
I've been doing my residency during the pandemic, so things are virtual.
Zoom, through Zoom.
But the court date in New York happens later, after 14 days of inpatient.
Yep, on the second hold. Or actually it might be a little different in California with laws, but okay, yeah. It's interesting, in our training as psychiatrists, and this is to answer your question, we're actually trained that if you're going to take someone's legal rights away and put them on a psychiatric hold into the hospital, they have to have, at least in California law, met one of three conditions. They're a harm to themselves, they're a harm to someone else, or what we call in California law at least, gravely disabled, meaning they cannot take care of themselves and their loved ones no longer can take care of them either. Meaning they're either so psychotic or so manic or so so kind of agitated that the loved ones say, I really can't actually take care of them, and they can't take care of themselves, food, clothing, shelter, etc. So they're put in the hospital in order to have psychiatrists or the care team work with them to actually get them to a point of stabilization. If that needs to be extended, and this is the answer coming back to your question, if that needs to be extended, that hold, because you're taking someone's legal rights away, the judge actually comes in and you have to, as a psychiatrist, present to the judge why it is that this person needs to stay in the hospital longer. Those are American laws. And they're important. So we were trying to figure out, is there any equivalent to anything like that in the Islamic tradition with the Maristans? Because they actually had inpatient psychiatric wards also. Today you can go, if anybody visits Cairo, visit Egypt, right in downtown Cairo, next to Masjid Hussein, right? Very kind of important place in Cairo to visit, right across the street from Al-Azhar University. When you go through the bazaar area, you'll end up in Qalawun. Qalawun is the Maristan that still stands in Cairo today. Qalawun was one of the leaders, and he had this Maristan. He also had a madrasa and a masjid and a mausoleum, and it's a whole complex of things together. But he had a Maristan. When you walk into that Maristan, you could still see the inpatient psychiatric ward. Can you imagine? SubhanAllah. So they had that practice. It was there for those who were very severely ill. What we found in the writings and the research historically is that same thing like we have today. If a patient said, I don't want to be here, they would bring them the qadi, the Muslim judge, to petition to not be in the hospital. And if they won their petition, they could leave. That was Islamic tradition. And then we learn in the writings that those were the most severe of the cases, because the majority of people that had mental illness were actually treated at home. They didn't come into the Maristan. So then you start to understand that they not only had a system, but they also had a system of ethics, of knowing that if someone is not well enough, but as soon as they start to get better and they want to go, they can. And the qadi or the judge or the ruler would allow for that to happen, facilitate. Does that make sense? So it is part of the tradition, and the laws and the ethics are all there. I hope that helps. Yeah. Oh, wow. I don't know whose hand went up first. Imam Khalid, help.
Go ahead, yes.
Oh, thank you. So can you speak a little bit to the relationship between Islamic tradition and psychiatry when it comes to gender dysphoria?
Yeah, I mean, this is not necessarily my own specialty. Right? Is the question, is there something historical about this, or is it, what is the question exactly?
I guess the question is, how do these two traditions understand this particular gender dysphoria?
Yeah, I mean, it's understood that this happens for some people. There are cases in which, in fact, it's written about. If you're asking historically, like in the historical writings, it is not necessarily seen as necessarily a mental illness. That's not where it would be classified, unless there was something else happening for that person as well. Perhaps if the reason they were doing that was because of another overlaying kind of condition they had. But otherwise, it was not seen or categorized under the mental illnesses, if that makes sense. Can we go to this side of the room and then we'll keep shifting back and forth? Yeah, maybe the far end. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for the lecture. My name is Amir and I'm a doctor. My reference is very far from psychiatry, but I have two fundamental questions. First one is, I've been doing research essentially for the last 3 years, and I know how much the medical literature, journals are corrupted, and a lot of politics, and I know a lot of problems. So what do you think is the optimal way that, it's very hard to convince people that the history is not right, we know much better than you, they won't accept. I've been reading a lot of books about the history. My area is neurosurgery and a lot of fields, in surgery, a lot of things that the Muslim scholars mentioned and worked on, but nothing mentioned. I was reading a book in Mayo Clinic and they say that Muslims are conservative people. They just translate what Greek and did, and they just preserve that until come to us. So it's very mean sentence actually that they consider everything we did are nothing. So what do you think the best way that convince those people that we did all things but maybe you don't know? And the other point is, a lot of books we weren't able to get those books because our books get lost in libraries like Baghdad and all. This is the first question. And the second question is, during your research, have you found anything about the organic causes of psychiatric diseases, like patient after stroke, after brain bleeding? They have problems or other diseases, because of like stroke and brain bleeding. Maybe they weren't identified a very long time ago. So our scholars.
But they were.
Yeah, but not like imaging, or there wasn't.
No imaging.
Yeah, they went to okay, there's a brain bleeding, and kind of cadaver or something, they can figure out that there is a bleeding. So are there any efforts on that? So this is my second question.
Yeah, these are great questions. So you have two questions just so that everybody can hear. One is kind of a point that I was making earlier, that Muslims are largely written out of history. And sometimes seems accidental and sometimes it feels purposeful, right? Like when they say all the Muslims did was translate, but they didn't add anything of their own accord. And I'm thinking to myself, do you not see the Maristans? Like, seriously? Like, I'm serious. Like, it is so upsetting when you see this and hear this. So your question was, how do you do this? Well, I'm telling you that I didn't think about this at first and like why mainstream medical journals, but that person, that mentor, that early research mentor, his advice of actually pushing through the current channels, as corrupted as they may be, but the point is those are the current channels. So when you push into the academic writing, his reasoning was, if you write something, I mean, one thing that you can say about current academic writing is that if the next person who's going to write a paper has to cite what comes before it. So he said, put it in the mainstream academic work so that they have to cite you. And if they leave it out, they're going to get called out for it. Do you see what I'm saying? And so that concept, and by the way, the Muslims did a beautiful job of citation, just have to say. They did. You see in their books, they cite the Greeks and the Romans beautifully. Just want to say it's part of our tradition, actually, to cite people. But their whole concept of citation today is really important because it pushes into the mainstream discussion. And make sure that what you're writing, it sounds like you're inspired to write something. Definitely, please, inshallah, you have tawfiq. But make sure that it's foolproof, that it's solid. I'll give you an example. Last month, alhamdulillah, we were really blessed to publish another paper, this time on Razi, Abu Bakr al-Razi. And it was published in the Harvard Review of Psychiatry. And that publication, what it talks about is that Razi was likely the first to do, and I'm going to give a backstory, but I'll just say it briefly, is he was the first to do something we call psychiatric aftercare. Which is interesting. Not only because he was a physician who had his own hospital, his own Maristan, and he treated a lot, both mental health and physical health. And he has these case studies, like 900 cases, many of which have mental health in them. Through that, we learned something. That Razi, he was probably the first to do this, and a lot of Maristans copied him after it. That he was, when they discharged psychiatric patients from his hospital, he gave them 3 gold dinars. That's a lot of money for that time. I just told you the treatment inside was free. Why would he give them money to leave as well, like as they were leaving? His reasoning that he writes, he says 2 of the gold dinars is because after you've been treated inside of a psychiatric facility, your friends and family might wonder, what were you doing? And so when you are able to go back into your community and have food, clothing, and shelter, you don't have to rely on anyone else. So you can integrate back into your community with dignity. I'm serious. With dignity, that's what he says. Do you see the foresight and the ihsan these people had? SubhanAllah, like he knew what was going to happen, so he was trying to mitigate it. And so he says the 3rd of the dinars that he's giving them, the gold dinar, is so that they can start their own business and become self-sufficient. I love it. It's so amazing. And so we wrote this, and you send it to something like the Harvard Review, and yeah, they're going to like back and forth and peer review and all of this, but at the end of the day, it's foolproof. It's ironclad. Like, what are you going to say? I'm giving you all the primary checks and all the proof. It changes history. Do you see what I'm saying, subhanAllah? If you go into Wikipedia right now and write Islamic medicine, the term that's going to pop up is called humanistic medicine. That's what we were known for. So you have all your proper citations and you have this ironclad argument that nobody can actually push against. It'll eventually get published. Do you see what I'm saying? It's really important that we still keep rewriting the narrative and keep pushing. Now, I told you about BAMMH and how excited I was and all of this. This last, I teach a course to our psychiatry residents at Stanford called Culture and Religion in Psychiatry. And I've been teaching this for years. Like I think I'm on my 11th cohort teaching them, mashallah. And this current cohort, I was telling them about the BAMMH story. And OCD. And suddenly they start laughing. And I was like, yo, what you guys laughing at? What's going on in here? And they were like, the lecturer right before you was the professor who was teaching about OCD. And his opening slide said, and in the 19th century is when OCD was discovered. And I said, what? Who is that? And he's one of our faculty members, right? And I was like, I'm going to hunt this guy down. I'm going to send him my paper, explain to him. But look, it's still, you could be in the same department. And still it's the same rhetoric that you got to keep pushing. Every time it happens, you keep correcting. You see what I'm saying? Right? You just got to keep pushing. And the other answer to your other question is, one of the things that we saw in our psychiatric writing is that Belkhi was one of the best that did this. He understood the difference between psychosis and neurosis. So the field that's today neurology and the field that's today psychiatry, he was able to distinguish them. So they were able to write about organic brain-based diseases separate from psychiatric diseases. And he actually made a difference in those classifications. Yeah, so take a look at that, inshallah.
So I have two that I think would be kind of, I have like a ton that's coming in. So if we don't get to your question, I'm really sorry. We're going to try our best in the amount of time that we have. But open invitation, Dr. Rania, you can come back here every week, inshallah.
I'd be honored. Can I say something though about that? Can I invite all of you to actually be part of some of the teaching efforts we're doing if you're interested? Because that's another place we can kind of bring your questions. Truly, I'm not trying to push the Maristan story on you, okay? Inshallah. All I'm trying to say is if you are actually following our social media and our mailing list, which are, again, the QR codes in the back, every month we actually have these open, free, completely open, everybody please join us, healing circles or learning circles. So every month what we do is we actually feature experts in the topic, something on mental health or maybe specific to the month we're in, substance abuse month, suicide awareness month, domestic violence, but whatever is happening at the time. Or if there's a crisis in the ummah, we do a healing circle. And Imam Khalid's been one of our speakers, mashallah, and Sheikh Fayaz as well. And I want to invite them to that.
Yeah.
Because that's monthly.
If you RSVP'd for this, which some of you did not, but if you RSVP'd for this, we'll share those emails with you,
Inshallah.
Dr. Rania.
Yeah.
So you can have those as well. There's a couple hundred RSVPs.
Inshallah, we'd love for you to be there.
So this question says, how does a family deal with unfair community onslaught of judgment and shame after a family member acts on their suicidal ideations and goes through with the act, especially in a Muslim society relating to forgiveness from Allah? And I would add to that, I think if you just maybe talk about if someone is struggling with suicidal ideation themselves, what are some of the things that individually they can do as a community? What are things that we can be mindful of if we're in interaction with someone who is expressing suicidal ideation? And then I had, after this, a second question that I'll put out, and then we can maybe go back to the...
Inshallah. Well, first I want to thank the person who brought that question up because it does take a lot of courage. That's a very difficult thing, and I want to tell you, I'm really sorry for your loss. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. To Allah we've come, and to Allah we will return. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant your loved one who passed the highest levels of Jannah. And Allahumma ameen. One of the things that we do in this training that I was talking about tomorrow with the imams that's specific, and community leaders that is specific to the topic of suicide, is we actually talk about this very question. It comes up so core and central in our conversations, and also the theological understanding related to suicide. And what I want to tell you about that, and we have different sections, and one of the sections relates to postvention, which is basically the term that says, how do you heal after a loss by suicide? How does the family and the community heal? And part of that is so antithetical to what we actually see happen in our community. So the fact that you're asking this question and saying there was a community onslaught after a person, a loved one, had died by suicide is so upsetting but so real. Because the people, what we call the lost survivors, basically the bereaved, the family and loved ones of a person who's died by suicide, what happens afterwards in so many of our communities is that they're ostracized, they're shamed, they're guilt-tripped. And then there's all these questions theologically around, well, is it even okay to pray for them? Right? There's all these conversations that we have with our imams in these trainings. Because A, they're at the front lines, but B, sometimes they kind of say the wrong thing and they don't necessarily know I mean it, right? Sometimes people say things inadvertently if you're not trained on how to say and what to say or how to figure out the red flags of what's happening in the first place. Does that make sense? And so I'm so saddened to hear that there are people who feel so shunned and ostracized when actually what should be happening is a whole lot of love and support. Look, I want you to hear me clearly, because people have started to say things like, oh, Dr. Rania says suicide's okay. Dude, like, what Islam says is what Islam says, okay? But what it says is very important. It talks about if somebody has full ration of what they're doing and planned it and had actual execution upon it, which is so different than what we actually know the science teaches us. The science teaches us that most people that die by suicide, and we know this from people who have attempted and didn't actually die, will tell you that they didn't actually want to die. And a lot of times it was in a moment of impulse, or they were 95%, that's the data, that's the stat, 95% of these cases are actually people that had mental health conditions. So right in that moment, they may not have been in their right mind, actually. And our deen has a lot to say about that, because what Islam actually says about this is that in those final moments, if a person is not actually cognitively there, Allah is the only judge for that. And we can't judge and say where that person is. So when you say, and I've heard all of this, I've even heard people say kafir, I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, how are you to say, you don't know your akhirah, I don't know my akhirah, to judge someone else's? And I am not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the ultimate judge. And hear me right, hear me clearly. When a person is in that moment, only Allah knows if they were rational or irrational in that moment, and will judge accordingly and in His mercy and rahmah. So when a person, the family who's supposed to be really like picked up and helped in that grieving moment, when we push them and ostracize them and shame them and tell them their loved one is in Jahannam, a'udhu billah, like, what are we doing? Is that really the community that we are? Is that really the understanding of the deen and our theology that we have? It really is kind of, I should say, messed up. I mean, honestly, it really is. It's so upsetting. Do you see what I'm saying? It doesn't even fall in suit with the theology. And when we talk with our teachers, our shuyukh, our mashayikh, and so on, when we talk through that, everyone's like, yeah, that's right. And then it becomes clear, it finally clicks. Because instead what happens, we put all this stigma and taboo, and we kind of like put all these walls up, and we're just like, no. Or the people who say this can't be happening in our communities. When we published on this, the recent study that we had in JAMA, which is a very reputable, obviously one of the top medical journals, the Journal of the American Medical Association, there were a lot of people who were like, whoa, shocked. We were shocked too when we wrote it, like the stats we found. But there are people who attacked us and called it garbage research. I don't know how you get anything to JAMA when it's garbage, but that's a different discussion for a different day and different time. Anyway, I think when you get so ideologically fixated on this can't be because we are religious people, I remind you, while Islam is perfect, Muslims are not. And the aspects of Islam that could actually be protective and gives us the resiliency, when it's not actually fully there and practiced, you lose some of those protective factors. And the reality is, so what do? Then you talk about it like what it is, a medical condition that requires health and treatment and healing. So if a person attempted, the solution isn't to criminalize them like they do in most Muslim countries and put them in jail. Nor is the solution to ignore and ostracize. The solution is to actually get them the mental health that they actually need. And if a death by suicide has happened, then there's a lot of healing that needs to happen for our communities. So I don't know if that fully answers the question or not, but my heart goes out to the person who asked. I'm really sorry that was your experience. And I really hope that when we know better, we do better, inshallah.
We can go back to it. I got like flooded with more questions after I said there's too many questions.
It's going to be here all day, inshallah. That's a barakallah, yes. Yeah.
So I have a question about how to support our children with mental health struggles, especially children who either are not Muslim or haven't necessarily developed their relationship with Allah yet to, for example, go directly to Allah with the things they struggle with. For context, I am a first-time third-grade teacher, and all of my kids even if they're not experiencing mental health struggle on their own, they know of things. And in particular, there's a few kids who I can tell because I studied psych undergrad and I'm diagnosed with ADHD, so I'm very familiar with it. There are a few kids who I can just tell, I'm pretty sure that they have ADHD, and classically are basically being punished for it every single day. And I struggle to know how to support them, especially in them not being Muslim, but at the same time feeling like I have this responsibility that Allah has given me to help them in a way that is not just, as you just mentioned, that is not criminalizing them, punishing them for being who they are, that is not ostracizing them from their community by calling them out. It is actually helping and supporting them. And also just kind of
I want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, subhanAllah. And you're right, like what do you do? So this question, we can even expand it beyond the third graders, bless your work, to even others, whether it's our own family members, whether it's our friends, whether it's other people in our circles, who we might recognize something that might be kind of a mental health piece to it. And how do you bridge them to care or try to convince? And children are a little bit more difficult because a third grader isn't going to themselves go to care. You got to convince the parents or the people who are the caretakers, right, of that child. And that's a whole other layer of conversation. So a couple of thoughts for you. One, and thank you, by the way, for sharing. I mean, it takes a lot for someone to say, I struggle with such and such. So that level of vulnerability, so jazakumullah khair. And sometimes it's that level of vulnerability that when you speak to the parents, if you can actually have in that parent-teacher setting, or maybe an email to the parent, or can I speak with you at the phone, that kind of thing, when you kind of open up with vulnerability, sometimes it works well, sometimes it backfires, depending on if the family's like ready to hear it or not. But sometimes they themselves have some suspicion, something's going on, but they don't have the language to explain what it is exactly. So if you were to say, I've struggled with this too, and this is where, if you're willing, and to say, this is what I see is happening in your child, X, Y, Z, and this is what you can actually do about it, that might be so relieving to family members and loved ones. So much so that I'll tell you in my own clinical practice, I'm not an ADHD specialist, and there are people who are, but I've had so many people, particularly I work a lot with women mostly, but men and women both, in my office, in my clinic, literally just break down. When adults like break down completely crying, because I'll say to them, I believe you have some symptoms that could be ADHD, and I'd like you to get tested for it. And they're like, what? And I'll tell them, you told me about this, and you told me this, and you told me this, and this is what it could be called. I can't tell you the kind of breakdown that happens as adults in my room, because for all their life, all the cases, there's language that I won't even use of what they were called, right? Because people just thought that they couldn't achieve or couldn't do or couldn't actually, like get things done or connect the dots or kind of keep with it enough, right? So they were called all these terrible things. And when you tell them this is actually a medical condition, and here's what it's called, and here are the symptoms, and this is how you treat it, the floodgate opens. Because all their life they had internalized that they were actually stupid. Do you see what I'm saying? And when they go and actually get the evaluation and the diagnosis, now they have a name for what this thing is called, that they didn't know what it was called before. And when they start getting better, it's like night and day. Do you see what I'm saying? And then there's all that anguish of like, why didn't anyone tell me this before? So when you can start with children early on, then you can save them from that whole anguish by the time they're adults. Do you see what I'm saying? So the reason why so many of our schools have school psychologists, what I encourage you to leverage that connection, is because they're embedded in the school already. And even if they can't do the testing themselves, they can refer or connect to testing and help. If the family is willing, they have to kind of give the willingness. But if enough of the teachers that care about that child are willing to say, there's something here, let's see, and if it's not, then it's not, but let's just see, could be really, really helpful. I hope that helps, inshallah. Barakallah, Fiki. I'm okay staying a little longer. There's a lot of hands still. Are you all getting tired? You're welcome to head out, inshallah. I don't know whose hand went first, and I'll find it, inshallah.
Yeah, go ahead. I have read several times about the Surah Al-Hashr, and it usually comes with it's like a treatment for depression. You mentioned that we have to address 3 parts for our better mental health. So it's mind, body, and soul. So when it comes to the soul, I'm a psychologist, and currently I'm working with people with anxiety mostly. And then and most of them have an Islamic background. So I'm just wondering, do you have research in terms of like the surahs and like the treatment for the certain disorders such as depression and Surah Al-Hashr, like because in Islamic lectures I've heard about that many times. Like, do you have research in that as well? Like,
yeah, I think the research still needs to be fully developed. I would just caution, if it's okay, if you don't mind, since you are a clinician.
Sure.
Yeah. You said you were a psychologist?
Yeah, I'm
mashallah, okay. I would just caution, just a word of caution. It would be important to make sure that as much as we might find the correlations, to make sure that you take everything into context. Why do I say that? Is because I'm finding a lot of excitement actually from folks who are in the field doing clinical work and saying, hey, I heard Surah Al-Duha is really good for X. Let me use this on this patient, without actually having a context or a frame of clinical use. It is not actually appropriate to open the Quran to say, here, read this verse, you're going to get better, or anxiety's better. That's not actually how it works. Forgive me, but it's just, I want to just be very clear about that.
Yeah.
I would encourage you, since you're a clinician, mashallah, and others in the room who might be in practice or hoping to practice one day, our training is a Western frame, right? To practice in this country, you need to have the proper credentials, and please don't cut corners. Please if you want to do this right, if you want to do this, then do it right. Get the training, get the licensure. Because there's too many people doing their side hustle as psychology. I don't know what they're doing, but they're really, inshallah. And then we have to clean up the problems afterwards, subhanAllah. So please, if you want to do this work, do it right. Don't cut corners. But also recognize that is it is from a secular Western kind of frame. And so I encourage you to take on the actual study of Islamic psychology if you want to bring in the Quran or the Sunnah into the clinical practice. So then you're going to ask me how, right? A couple of programs that have now emerged that I really encourage. One of them has to do with that book. That book introduces a model of psychology called TIP, Traditionally Integrated Islamic Psychotherapy, TIIP, TIP. And it actually has trainings, level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. Go through the TIP training, just like you would if somebody wanted to get marriage family therapy and become Gottman trained or whatever. They go through the levels of that particular philosophy of training. You see what I'm saying? The TIP model is like that. We've created, alhamdulillah, a model, worked on it quite hard. They're actually for clinicians that want to learn how to bring Islamic principles into the clinical practice. Another program that's emerged recently is a diploma in Islamic psychology at Cambridge Muslim College, CMC. And I teach there, I'm faculty there, and teach part of the diploma in Islamic psychology. It's a 9-month program. In which you are part-time for those who are working clinicians to take this program part-time, and they're able at the end of it to have a diploma in Islamic psychology. So there are now emerging programs that I really encourage the clinicians in the room, if they want to do this, please don't just open the Mus'haf and say, here, this, like learn the clinical frame and the model so that you're able to actually integrate it properly into your clinical care. Does that help?
Yeah, very
Inshallah.
much. Thanks.
Yes. Yeah.
So I am a third-year psychiatry resident, and recently, we've been doing a lot of journal clubs surrounding hallucinogens and the use in depression and trauma. And I haven't been able to speak with somebody who is trained in Sharia, and I'm very curious how would Islamic modality approach kind of the use of mind-altering substances for the treatment of mental health conditions, and how do you speak to Muslims when they ask you questions about this?
Yeah, that's like the $1 million question right now. And it will, and I'll tell you, the answer will be premature because we haven't fully studied it, but the questions come up multiple times. And I'm actually intrigued, I'm actually interested because there is starting to be a good amount of research and study into, particularly, psilocybin, just the various, I won't even go into the names of everything so I don't want to confuse anybody in the room, but just the various forms. And so I'll go back to the maqasid al-sharia, the foundational principles that says, remember I told you about the preservation and optimization of the intellect? The rules that are built upon that, you can see where, and this is a long-winded, but I'll come back to the answer, When you look at the reason why something like alcohol is considered haram in Islam, or drugs, whether illicit or recreational, are considered to be haram in Islam, this very heavy word, haram, the reason it's there is because of that foundational principle. Anything that alters the intellect is prohibited. Because Islam in its very origin is a preventative religion. When you look at medicine, Islamic medicine, a lot of it is preventative medicine in the first place. So when you look at that from that frame, you start to understand why anything that has a mind-altering substance or property to it won't be used. Where are the exceptions? The exceptions are if, for example, what you have there, and this is what's happening now with that field, is you're finding that if you take some of those substances in their original form, they are heavily mind-altering. But if you put them in medicinal form, it's like a 50th of their original property, and they're not in and of themselves necessarily mind-altering, and they have a medicinal property. I'm not giving a fatwa. Not what I'm doing right now. I'm just explaining. Not giving a fatwa, folks. I was very clear. We're going to come out of Dr. Rania said, go take shrooms. Be careful, be very careful here.
We are in the village, by the way.
Exactly where I am. That's a lot. But there are discussions in Islamic medicine that talk about, just in kind of Islamic law in general, that talks about could you use something for a medicinal property that in and of itself could have been problematic or has some like shak or just doubts about its validity Islamically? And the answer is that's where I was saying, like, if in and of itself they've reduced it to a form in which it's no longer has that heavy mind-altering kind of hallucinogen type of property to it, but they've now put it and kind of refined it to where it has a medicinal property. Could it be used? There is potential.
And I suppose if it's restoring somebody to like that optimized state of health, like if that's the end result.
If that's what
happens, yeah.
I think and honestly, because there's a lot of research now, and I'm actually quite interested to find, because I'm very interested in, like, again, 5 senses, mind, body, soul, like what are those substances and what are those types of healing methods that may be non-invasive, useful, not addictive, et cetera, et cetera. And so as they refine it, could they come to a point where it is actually has a medicinal value to it? And then it becomes permissible to use? It is possible. Right? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I just don't think we're there yet. I think it's too early.
Thank you so much. It was a tough question.
Yeah. No, it's important to go back to the original legal framing, and then you're able to actually just see where you're at and then build from there, if that helps.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thank you so much. Just a question in terms of when the Maristans existed in our heritage, was there a place for sort of the neurodivergent population? Maybe it was misunderstood at that time, so whether it be autism or other similar kind of diagnoses or not, maybe those didn't exist at that time. So I know we're talking about traditional mental illness, psychiatric kind of paradigms, but was there a place for neurodivergent?
Was there a place? I'm sure there was a place, because there were these institutions of healing. Have we found something that specifically kind of translates into what we today would call autism? I haven't seen it just yet. Is it possible that it's there? Because if we understand it correctly, to know that neurodivergence has been there since the start of humankind, then likely it was there. Do we still have to make those connections? I think we actually still do. Maybe we'll be surprised. SubhanAllah. I'm telling you, we are recruiting people who are interested in this very nerdy field of history, who have the linguistic capabilities to help us on this particular line of research. There's 9 lines of research in my lab. One of them is on the history of Islamic, understandings of early mental health understandings, perceptions, and attitudes, and so on. There's 8 other lines. One is on Islamic psychology, one's on suicide, one's on substance abuse, there's many, many different ones. And so anyway, but that particular line of the history one is so specific and unique because you need people with linguistic capabilities and people who are interested in history and that are able to actually understand the Turath, basically that early primary text, and be able to translate and bridge it to modern psychological understanding. It's very, very nuanced, but we're always looking for talent, mashallah. So you can talk to me later about that if you're interested. But I do hope we find some. If we find some, we'd be happy to write about it and publish on it, inshallah. All the way in the back. Let's sit down.
Brief intellectual question.
is your lab accepting any future PhD students virtually?
So my lab, so SubhanAllah, because of COVID, it was an in-person lab at Stanford, and because of COVID, SubhanAllah became a remote lab. And we do accept students remotely. There is an application cycle that opens in the summer. You'll find the application open up on our lab's website. So if you just can Google Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab or Muslim Mental Health Islamic Psychology Lab, it'll pop up. And in the summer is when we open up our cycle. And then there's very specific criteria to be part of the lab, to be an intern there. Mashallah, we just recruited our new group this year. It's about 30 of them, mashallah, and they're, working away on all the different lines of research. Yeah, mashallah. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. So much to be so valuable. I'm interested to know, so you mentioned the 3 different levels that are given by Allah as treatment, so medicinal talk therapy, and then the spiritual heart, kind of creating the right conditions for all 3 of those, so you can flourish. I'm wondering, so as a 4th year medical student as well, who's probably this residency as well, a concern of mine is that 3rd layer, which also seems like the deepest, the spiritual, is not integrated into Western understanding and approach to treatment. So at times it can feel like the work there is actually empty. So I'm wondering, I guess maybe part of this movement and revival is to get that introduced into inpatient psychiatry. So I guess it's maybe a question or how to integrate that really. There's no, I guess for a structure itself that doesn't acknowledge the soul, how to really go about doing that, and does it kind of have to happen on an outpatient basis with particularly Muslim patients? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so just to repeat, the question was for somebody who's in the field going to psychiatry, mashallah, I'm really excited about all the people coming into the field. Inshallah, I always tell people, make sure, inshallah, again, don't cut corners, do this well, do it right, be excellent, inshallah, what you do. Make sure you also are, I hope it's okay to say this, but if you really want to work with the Muslim population and really want to help fully, paralleling that with some Islamic knowledge is going to be really important. Truly, that's my main message to folks that talk about wanting to go into this field. I'm there's no Islamic psychology without Islam, folks. Make sure you have that piece too. The good news is the field, even though it's been largely secular, and especially it's you're talking about a secular field and psychiatry that's even more secular than average, right? And now you're wanting to talk about spirituality. But the interesting thing is that's the direction the field is going in, interestingly enough. And it's not just Muslims writing about this. There's a lot of efforts from other faith traditions that are also pushing spirituality, and even non-faith traditions, just the concept of spirituality. So actually the time is pretty good. It's kind of ripe right now. In your psychiatry residency, wherever you end up matching, inshallah, make sure that there is something in the curriculum that talks about religion and spirituality. Why? Because it actually is an ACGME requirement. It's part of the requirement of every psychiatric grad to take in their course of training something about religion and spirituality. But you know what most programs do? They just sort of hide it under culture, right? And it's not at the forefront. And I'll tell you, this was our example at Stanford. That's how when I went through training, I kept complaining about it. I'm yeah. And so literally, this is no joke, the day I graduated from residency, one of the program convening directors came up to me and said, "You complained about this so much, now you go teach the class." And I was like, what? And so I literally have to, with a co-teacher, kind of rewrote the whole curriculum on religion and culture in psychiatry. And it's hard. Training our psychiatry residents who are kind of you get all, the culture is okay still, you get all the way to religion, they're no. And it's look, honestly, you are making room for every other form of identity, all these intersectional identities, you are making room for them at the table except for religion, which means you're making room for everybody else except me, right? People of faith communities. And when you put it that way, people are oh, they don't want to be a clinician that doesn't make room for people, you know what I'm saying? And so then they're willing to kind of listen, and it's a work in progress. But the reason I say that is there are good curricula now in residency training programs, including ours at Stanford, that actually teach you how to bring the discussion of spirituality to clinical care. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm amazed, actually. One of the grants we have this year is something called, it's a religion and spirituality clinical competency, religion and spirituality competencies in clinical care. So we developed in our lab an entire full-on training for clinicians of how you integrate spirituality into clinical care, and ours is focused on Islam. And we're paired with these other teams. Some are focused on Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and just other non-religion, kind of spirituality traditions. So there's an effort that's growing, and if you want to bring this to your training programs, we're happy to come train, because we're in that pilot year right now, hoping to then have it kind of be a consistent part of residency curriculum trainings, and also psychology training programs too. So just get in touch with us, inshallah, at the lab. We're happy to connect that with your program.
There's a bunch that I think we could lump together that came in online. There's a lot that were asked around having toxic or abusive parents, both physical abuse, but especially when abuse is emotional. And the extent of Islamic advice that's given usually is that it's important to just be patient and obedient. So do you have advice on dealing with toxic or abusive parents as a Muslim?
Yeah, definitely. I remind us, all of us together, that the actual original ruling on this, on any, actually not just this, on any relationship with any human being, including the parents, is لا طاعة للمخلوق في معصية الخالق. There is no obedience to the creation if it means disobeying the Creator. So when there are actual toxic relationships, abuse in particular, but other forms of toxicity as well, Islam does not put on you the same rulings as a person who has parents or loved ones that don't abuse them. So whereas the original kind of status quo kind of rule is birr al-walidain, righteousness to parents, whether they're Muslim or not Muslim, righteousness to all parents. There is, for every Islamic ruling that's a baseline ruling, there's also the caveats, the exceptions to the rule. And in Islam, this rule has exceptions to it too, and it says that you cannot actually put yourself in harm's way. And if you're being harmed in this way, and there's different forms of abuse, and yes, it can be subjective, what is abuse, but there are different forms of abuse. That if this is happening to you, Islam and Allah does not put you in a situation to continue being abused. There is no obedience to the creation if it means disobeying the Creator, because the Creator said take care of yourself. And in taking care of yourself, then you can take care of others. This is really important. And so people hear this and say, is this some Western nonsense about putting boundaries and all the rest? She knows it. You know you heard this. Mashallah. And I say to you, the Prophet ﷺ put his boundaries in place for people who were toxic to him too. And some of them were his own blood. And I think that's important to understand, because the way we're taught, Islam sometimes is very limited, but it's expansive. And the way we're taught Islam sometimes is so black and white that there is a whole lot of gray. And this is where the differences of opinion in Islam come from, and the different scholars that spoke to these different questions that came through. And I just think it's important to have a more expansive understanding of Islam. Does that make sense? And so what I'll say in just closing this particular question, like this collapsed question, is that please know that it's a case-by-case scenario. Please talk to a person who is learned and can help. And maybe that is your therapist, and maybe it's the Imam, and maybe it's the combination of the two, right? And in that you're able to assess, hey, is it my own misperceptions of what's happening and I'm exaggerating the story? Or is it actual real harm? Because it might actually very well be real harm, and you're not, and no one should gaslight that. Like, it's your reality. And so I think it's really important to understand, but sometimes it's hard to know for yourself, because what does a therapist actually do for you? They put the mirror up. So you can actually see the reality of what's happening. And it's not just in your own mind. You can have a neutral third party actually be able to tell you, does this make sense or not? And if it really is something that requires some boundary drawing, then that's what you need to do. Because Islam does not tell you to keep putting yourself in harm's way.
And we had another set of lumped questions, but I think when you just said something, it made me remember. Many of you know that we've started a domestic violence agency through the Islamic Center, its own nonprofit, called Pillars of Peace. And at the end, I'll share some resources with you all, but if you're stepping out or leave before we finish, Pillars offers free trauma counseling right now in English, French, and Arabic. In a couple of weeks, we'll also add Urdu and Hindi to that. And so if you're in a place, you know somebody who's in a place that is dealing with abusive family relations, is looking for trauma counseling. It's at no cost, and you can check out their website or let me know, and I'll make the connections. We had a good number of people also, maybe this could be one of the wrap-up questions, and we can take a couple of minutes just to make some announcements at the end.
Of course.
A good number of people have said, what do they do when they try therapy and it doesn't seem to work? And they've had long-term experiences with trauma. They seem to keep resurfacing, like they keep reliving it, and it now impacts both their professional and personal segments of their life.
Yeah, may Allah give ease, Ya Rabbi, to all. Allahumma ameen. This is a really, actually, I'm so glad it came up, because I want to say this sentence related to therapy. I have this interesting way of thinking about it. You may not agree or like it, but I think of therapy as something in which you have to actually keep on trying until you find the right fit. To me, it's a lot like courtship. You talk to different people until you find the right fit. And sometimes it just takes a while. And that's the reality of it. Honestly, just because it didn't work with the first therapist or the second therapist, please do not give up. It really does take a while sometimes. Sometimes it works immediately, mashallah. You just find that right fit. It's magic, subhanAllah. But sometimes it really isn't, and it just actually takes time. Do not give up. And then depending, and I'll say it this way, depending on how long the difficulty has lasted, whether it's trauma or whether it's something from childhood or whether it's or how deep the trauma was, think about it. If it took that long for you to be here, it's probably going to take about that long for you to heal too. So don't give up on therapy. I mean, inshallah, it goes faster, okay, inshallah. But the reality is, if it's that long and that deep, this is going to take some time. So people who've never been in therapy before, sometimes they hope that it's a session or two and then they're done. No, that's not how therapy works, especially not trauma-based therapy. And so there's a lot of, subhanAllah, work. But the thing is, if you put the effort in, and inshallah you do, and the therapist, inshallah, is actually trained, that's the other thing. Different therapists are trained in different modalities. It could be in what they are trained with is not what you need. So you find the therapist who specializes in what you need. Does that make sense? And then subhanAllah, together, there actually could very well be a healing property that happens that just, sometimes it needs to take its course. And so for the person who says that it might take, it keeps on resurfacing, to me that's an indication, Wallahu a'lam, that this is something that is not sufficiently treated. The other thing to know is that when it's a chronic condition, any of the chronic conditions, chronic depression, chronic anxiety, trauma that's lasted from a long time, what happens when we don't actually fully process it or heal it, we kind of push it under the surface and we go about our daily lives. And then sometimes out of the blue, it just pops up again. Or we think we pushed it far down enough, and then maybe the period of life in which it happened to us, you go on in your life and then you have your children, let's say, or you get married, or you have a job, or when something happens, and when it hits that same time period, it reminds you of what happened in your childhood, and bam, suddenly pops up again. And you're where did this come from? I thought I was doing fine for years and years and years, but it wasn't sufficiently processed and dealt with. And that's not your fault. It just takes some time to kind of go through that. But please know that there is actual good healing that can happen. And so many people that have had some serious things happen live very fruitful lives and very productive lives. And sometimes they require to be in therapy longer than others, or have like periods where they're in therapy, then they're like having kind of like a pretty stable period, and then they need to go back in again because some other big thing happened in their life that kind of dipped them a bit. Most conditions are what we call in mental health, waxing and waning. So the thing about therapy, what's beautiful about it, is that these little ups and downs, little ones are fine. It's the big dips that are a problem. So what therapy does is it kind of pulls you from the depths, right? And kind of keeps you a little bit more up here. So you have the normal ups and downs, not these huge downs. And that could be for a while for some people. For most situations, a course of therapy teaches you the skills and techniques you need, and then you are able to do it for yourself. And when something other big thing happens in your life that you need therapy for, then you'll go and you get more skills and techniques for that thing, right? So it could just be that it's punctured all throughout your life, or you keep revisiting it, right? Or you dip and you need a little more help, and all of this is normal. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
I think the last question, how do you separate the judgments and wrongful religious mindset of close ones who have affected your understanding and belief in Islam to your actual own belief?
Mm-hmm.
I consider myself a non-practicing Muslim now, but I'm a second-year Master's of Public Health student, passionate about mental health, and hearing you talk really opened my eyes in a completely different light. I'm not sure how to move forward with that, but I would love to hear what you have to say about connecting with a religion I have disagreements with, but feeling a sense of some spiritual connection to it still.
Alhamdulillah. May Allah bless you. May Allah bless you. May Allah bless you. I mean, mashallah. I hope, inshallah, through the next stages for you that you do find that kind of healing. And if there is a healing in this Islamic spiritual tradition, which I believe is there, then I hope, inshallah, you're able to kind of access it as well. One of the things that we teach in the course that I was telling you about, I have this week where I call it religion that harms and religion that heals. And it's so sad because when I think back, even the way I learned Islam early on, a lot of it was quite harmful, just being honest. It was a lot of very black and white, a lot of very rigid, a lot of no understanding of the many, many differences of opinion and the space and breadth of Islam. If you truly believe this religion is meant to be for all people at all times, in all places, in all traditions, then it's got to be able to expand to fit all people in all traditions and all backgrounds and all people. Does that make sense? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if you find Islam taught in a way, or you were taught Islam in a way that doesn't fit all people, then it's not the kind of brand of Islam that actually is what it was meant to be. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So if you're starting to find some inklings of spirituality that actually could be healing, I encourage you, inshallah, please continue to connect to that, because there may be healing properties that you do agree with that are very helpful to you. And through that process, you may be able to reconcile with some of the things that maybe the way in which it was taught doesn't actually turn out to be the only way it's thought about Islamically. And in that, you find some healing too. Does that make sense? I hope so, inshallah. I have a lot of hope in these things. Call me a hopeless optimist, I don't know, inshallah. But seriously, like, I'm very optimistic about this, and I think that when you can see that, wallahi, we say this, right? The people who are the most learned in Islamic tradition are usually the quietest. Because they understand how many differences of opinion of the scholars who, very with adab and etiquette, kind of agreed to disagree, but they're all part of the Islamic tradition at the end of the day. And there are so many of these opinions that when you know how many opinions are out there, you're so quiet because you realize all of these people fit into Islam. And those who have a limited knowledge are usually the ones running their mouth. SubhanAllah. I'm being very serious. Like, it is actually very harmful. A little bit of knowledge is actually more harmful sometimes than no knowledge at all. So I hope and pray that you're able to connect to healing sources of this faith and healing sources of our tradition and our heritage, and through that be able to find ways in which you're able to not only heal for yourself but heal others, and for all of us in this room. Allahumma amin.
If everyone can join me in just thanking Dr. Rania for amazing talk. take a moment to stop at the info table. If you RSVP'd for the talk, we'll share your contact info with Maristan. And if for whatever reason you're not able to scan and it gets busy over there, the RSVP doc is still open. You could just fill that out with your contact info, and we'll share that tomorrow, the day after, inshallah. And I'll send you all an email after this for those who RSVP'd with the info on the organization as well. So a few quick announcements before we let everybody go. There's a couple in our community who, if you remember, 2 Jum'ahs ago, I mentioned to you all, Sufyan and Samiha, their son Zidan was born about 3 weeks ago, mashallah, and had a lot of complications with seizures. She had just emailed me and said that they had weaned baby Zidan off of the medicine, and it resulted in seizures on the other side of his body. And so they're putting him back to the medical protocol. They reached out again asking if we could just keep him in our prayers. Please make special dua for our baby brother, as well as his parents. As we heard with the example given before of our own Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the difficulty of a parent having to deal with these realities of a child in front of them. And this couple from here in our community actually lives in Seattle now. And they still feel connected to you all, mashallah, and know that this is a community that takes the time to pray for one another. So please do keep them in your dua if you can. We had at Jummah today a table set up outside. I don't know if you want to just really quickly explain to people.
Sure. Assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm with an organization called DRUM, Daisy's Rising Up and Moving, and right now we're calling for signatures for a petition for the Pakistan floods, and we're asking for those to sign on to the TPS and SSR petition. It basically gives visiting undocumented and international students, which is basically equivalent of over 60,000 immigrants that are in the United States that are Pakistani, the special status that then grants them benefits for workers, as students. And so it takes less than a minute. I have the QR code, I'll add it up there. And if you can just sign on to the Move On petition, that'd be really helpful in getting it.
These are basically people who are here who want to be able to send money to their loved ones, but they're not allowed to because the policy does not allow for them to work. Right? I've been in a lot of conflict zones and areas of natural disaster, refugee camps. Some of you have seen pictures of the visits that I've been able to go on. And to live in that circumstance in and of itself, may Allah grant them ease. Yeah. When you're in a place where you're separated from your loved ones in a hostile system that doesn't even see you as human enough to be documented in the ways that they give you certain rights, you can't do fundamentally what your heart is calling you to do. So all it literally is that you're signing onto a petition that's going to help somebody be able to send money that they are making through the policy change to their loved ones who are in need. So definitely see Amna before you head out. Encourage others to sign up as well. Inshallah, it'll be a means of benefit for all those who are facing a lot of difficulty right now. On Monday, we're going to have a program here with Sheikh Ahmad Shukri. It's going to be at 6 o'clock during the time that I would normally do my halakha here. He's going to speak on the optimism of the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. So definitely come out for that. On Wednesday night, Sheikh Faz Jafar and I are going to be doing a program here that just speaks about practical and simple ways that our traditions respectively speak about to increase barakah in your time. Right? We see a lot of people who just are feeling overwhelmed, and it just seems like there's not enough time in the day. And our tradition teaches us so much in terms of how we can increase barakah so we can do more with our time. So come, please, if you can. The building will be closed on Thursday, and on Friday we'll open it for Jummah only, and then it'll be closed for the rest of the weekend. For those of you who are around over the break, I would recommend that, in spaces like this, we normally start off by asking people to just talk to the people around them and introduce themselves, because all of us don't know the rest of us. If you could do that as we're getting ready for Isha, and as you go out into the hallway. And if there's things you're going to be doing, New York City can be a very lonely place. It's not so easy to be here always. And there's many people who this is where they'll be spending the course of the coming week. If you have capacity to include people in what you're doing, it would be amazing. We'll send out some info on some other stuff that we're going to have going on, inshallah. But you can take it upon yourself to invite individuals so that they're not spending 4 or 5 days, just waiting until next week comes around thereafter. Does that make sense? We have 2 clinical psychologists on our staff here at the Islamic Center, Dr. Tara Gore and Dr. Marwa Asar. They primarily provide one-on-one counseling to students only. Our liability coverage is embedded within the university's apparatus, and they are not able to see other than students. For those of you who are not students here, we have a referral system that we connect individuals to. Many of you know me. I cannot provide anything psychotherapeutic to you, and I'm not going to pretend like I can, but there are so many in our community who are well poised and trained in every discipline that you can imagine. If you are somebody who has that capacity to provide those services, please let me know so I can add you to this referral list. But if you're in a space where you are looking to engage in therapy for yourself, you're trying to explore that, definitely take heed of Dr. Rania's advices, and let it be something that you engage in a try-test methodology. When I first saw a therapist, I tried to go see somebody who was Muslim. And in New York City, I walked into a Muslim therapist's office. Before I even said anything, they said, "Hey, you're Khalid Latif." It's not going to work for me. So my therapist was an elderly white Catholic man. And I'm not saying you should go see an old white man, but it worked better for me because I needed to still feel comfortable in that space. And I'm not uncomfortable around Muslims, at least not most of the time. But in that moment, it wasn't going to work. And so we can help connect you in ways. You don't have to pathologize yourself in order to also seek out these types of resources and services. Sometimes it's just good to have a place to self-express so you can begin to think about what it is that you're thinking about. And where we can be helpful in making those connections, definitely let me know, let our staff know. Dr. Marwa, in addition to the counseling she provides, on Wednesdays, won't be next Wednesday, but Wednesdays in general, she does a halaqah here weekly that's called a halaqah for your emotional and mental well-being. And you should come to it, you should join it online. She's a great resource, mashallah, and avail yourself of the opportunity. The last thing that I'm going to say before we break is we got derailed during the pandemic from our community's growth strategy. And some of you have been here for a while, some of you have just been here for months. To me, I don't believe that I'm given a platform for it to be self-serving. I'm trying to build as much as I can, inshallah, and part of that strategy is paying for my weaknesses, that I know what it is that I'm not trained or skilled to do, and what it is that we can also then think about institutionally beyond our center here. So we've started with members of our community a Sunday school that'll lay a foundation for educational curriculum for young people in our community. We have a donor advised fund that's now its own nonprofit entity that over the pandemic, we, mashallah, through it, we're able to distribute about $6 or $7 million in micro cash grants to people who were dealing with food insecurity, homelessness, survivors who are now stuck at home with their abusers during the pandemic. we started Pillars of Peace, which is its own nonprofit also, that's going to, inshallah, be an entire suite of services similar to a sanctuary for families type model, legal advocacy, financial empowerment, counseling, residential centers, etc. And so moving on in that trajectory, the idea was prior to the pandemic, that first summer in 2020, we were going to host a series of sessions to think out what's the next 10 years going to look like. And then I thought, well, maybe the next summer we could do it. And now we are where we are. Inshallah, we're endeavoring and intending to do this post-Ramadan in 2023. One of the things in our strategic growth plan is going to be the establishment of a holistic wellness center. And understanding that the people who are going to help us build that are going to be you all. And recognizing, as Dr. Rania said, that you can't expect anybody to build for us, or we have to build for ourselves. And so when the time comes, we're going to need all of you to step in ways where you leverage your credentials, your skills, your resources. I see people every day and get contacted in every which way possible who are just hurting a lot. And it's not going to work that they're just met with religious platitudes. So for us to dig deep and recognize when we open the shelter with Pillars of Peace, that subhanAllah looks beautiful. I wish I could take all of you, but for confidentiality reasons, we cannot. I took my son and my daughter when we first purchased the building, and it was pre-renovation. And I took them some weeks ago when it's now in its last phase. We're just waiting for one last fire inspection. Make dua that the building department actually does this soon. And my son Kareem, as we were walking around and looking in each room, he took a pause in the bedroom for a moment and he said to me, "Baba, are there gonna also be children that live in this shelter?" And I said, "Yes, Kareem, there will be." And he paused for a moment and he said, "Baba, I think they're going to be really happy here." And I said, "Kareem, inshallah, they will be beyond happy." This is a community that's known as a giving community. And we bring amazing people like this to help us to understand as well, aspirationally, what we can potentially endeavor to become as individuals, but then communally, what we also have to build to fill certain gaps. There's a lot of people that are hurting right now. And the way I said to you like 6 years ago, we're going to build a shelter. Alhamdulillah, we did. We're going to build a wellness center. We're going to make sure that we provide services to people who are struggling with so much that nobody should have to go through by themselves. And so think about it, what it means to you. Make dua for it, that Allah grants us tawfiq in this as well as other endeavors. I don't have a timeline on it, so if you come to me tonight and say, "I want to be a part of it," I'm going to say, amazing, but it's going to be down the line. But we start thinking about it now. We start praying in our prostrations for it now. We start doing what we can to build inwardly for it now. And then there's going to be a bunch of other things that this community will build. The clinics, the food pantries, other ventures that we are uniquely poised to and will do simply because it's the right thing to do. And we're already in a place where Dr. Rania has graciously offered that we can learn from the best practices of the work that she's already done, so we don't have to start from scratch. I know I said that was the last thing I was going to say, but this is going to be the last thing. There's not a lot of times when we have stories of hope. And one of the ways that we remedy some of the gaps around mental health is that all of you in this room, you play a role in adding to the discourse by not presenting an interjection and absolute perspective that says there's nothing there. Because even if that's what you think, you know now of at least one institution that's run by one person that I could tell you there's a lot more. She just told you in her lab she took on 30 interns, let alone everybody else. So the way we shift the narrative and we start to normalize is that you tell stories that are actually happening on the ground, and you build a positive frame.
that doesn't say, look at what's not there, but indicates and highlights what's actually there. And then you make dua that Allah makes you from the best of supporters of initiatives like this, because this is what we really need at this time. And you're more poised to actually play a role in making it happen than you might realize. Right. So when you get the emails from Maristan, don't read them as if they're intended for somebody else. They're for you. And if you felt a little bit of opening here tonight, then ask yourself, why would you not participate in so much more that they're offering to you? And then when we have the opportunity to bring something here to our city, you're already at the forefront of knowing how we can do that, because you spent so much time benefiting, albeit virtually, from all the good work that they're doing on the West Coast in this regard, and then we'll be steps ahead of it. Does that make sense? Okay. So please join me in making just dua for our Sheikha, Dr. Rania Awaad, that Allah continues to make her a source of healing, a source of strength, a source of luminosity for His creation, and that He grants her tawfiq in all of her endeavors and makes her organization, Maristan, the work that she does in her lab, a means of benefit for His creation without any condition or qualification, and that for any who are in a place right now, whether it's in our community, on the streets of the city, really anywhere in the world, that they are feeling alone, that they're struggling with just pain, trauma inwardly of any kind, that Allah lets each one of them find the healing that it is that they're in need of. That He makes this community always a reason that people have hope in this world, and never the reason that people might dread it.
We hope you enjoyed our podcast. If you're inspired by the work that we're doing at the IC and want to help keep it going, subscribe to our podcasts, follow us on social media, donate to help support us at icnyu.org, and most importantly, keep us in your continued du'as. Until next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.